Okay, welcome to Norbu Mind Training Center. Old friends and new friends, and there is some kind of distortion or a waterfall. Yeah, that's better. This weekend is entitled Cultivating Emotional Awareness, and I think most of us sometimes feel that our emotions make trouble for us. They sometimes torment us, and they sometimes seem to be completely out of control. And the question is, what can we do about that? And actually, this whole place, Norbu, it's in a way it's about that, getting to know our minds and cultivating the wholesome qualities like stability and clarity of mind, focus and kindness and all the good stuff, and also working on the things that tend to torment us, the anxiety, the anger, the despair. So it's really like we have all these physical fitness centers where we go to take care of our bodies, but this is a place to come and take care of our minds and our brains. And we're part of a global organization called the FPMT, Foundation of the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition. Very easy, simple name there. And there's about 160 centers and services across the world in about 40 countries. Our tradition was founded by two great teachers who are here next to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Lama Sopa and Lama Yeshe. And Venerable Robina, she was ordained a monk, I think it's 76 or something like that. 78. Did I say monk? Oh. Yes, she's most certainly a nun. That's interesting. Anyways, and she's been just devoting her entire life to teaching people like us with a great urgency. She just travels around the world, lap after lap, teaching people these, I think, really vital skills for our time. She's edited a lot of books. The Dharma, she's been the editor of a magazine called Mandala. She started something called the Liberation Prison Project, which is working with prisoners in death row, for example, in the US and now across the world. So she's just a wonderful, wonderful teacher. She's been coming here to Sweden for about 10 years. She's been instrumental in getting this place up and running, and I'm just honored to have her back here. A few practical details. If you haven't turned off your phone, that's a really good idea. Also, don't leave it on vibrate, just nothing, otherwise, yeah, it still makes a noise. There's two toilets in the back, one there and one if you go around the corner. There's an emergency exit over there, and of course you can go out where you came in. And also this is being streamed, so we're actually live on Facebook and YouTube. So if you don't feel comfortable being broadcasted, then maybe you could, if you have questions, you can maybe write them down and give them to me if you don't want to speak. The camera will be on Venerable, but still. And I think that's pretty much all I have to say, and we'll see if we can find Venerable. Does that mean 1 minute? It's okay. And if you like, you can, just as a sign of respect, stand up when Robina comes. Not mandatory, but it's customary.
All right. Bit lower. Okay, I'm really fine. I promise. Okay, yeah, do it. It's going to be too close to my clothing. Oh, the plant. I'm sorry, the plant. Okay. Okay. It's fun. It's hard to be conscious while I was thinking. I was trying to remember each thing as it was happening. You know, falling, seeing the dirt, feeling my body going down, noticing all the things. Sort of all. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know whether there was 10 stairs behind me. I was waiting to fall. You know, it's very interesting keeping your mind clear while that happens. Most interesting experience. Okay. Where were we? What are we supposed to do today? What are we here for? What's the topic?
The topic is cultivating emotional awareness.
Oh, very good. That was a very good test. No, I really was doing it as I was falling, because all your normal expectations are gone. You know, you're sitting in a chair, then suddenly you're not. So I remember, I noticed seeing everything go, and the dirt on the floor, and the plants go boom, and my head go bounce. You know, and notice immediately. Check the body, of course, to see if there's anything broken. And nothing. Only just my elbow. That's only just a bit of pain there. Nothing else. Head's fine. Emotional what? Balance.
Awareness.
Awareness. Okay,
yes.
Awareness. Okay. Okay. Well, let's just sing our little prayer that sets us going. And it's expressing two things. For those of us who in the room already identify with being a Buddhist, it's reminding us of our reliance on the Buddha and his teachings to help us get emotional awareness so we can develop our amazing potential. So that in turn, as the second line express, why? Because our altruistic, our bigger motivation, our bigger reason, not just for our own sake, but because we live in this crazy planet together, so we can be a benefit to others, you know. That's the essence of it. So we're here for this reason. So that means we're listening to these teachings as advice. It's advice. You don't have to take it. You're the boss, not Buddha. It's really important to remember that. But it is advice. It's meant to be, every word should be advice to help us do that job. Okay, so I'll sing a little in Tibetan, these ideas. Sangye charang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chonyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog sangye charang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chonyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog sangye charang soke chognam la 장초 바루 dagni kyab suchi dagi chonyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye drupa sho. Well, it's really interesting in Buddhism. I don't think there's no word for emotion. Not that they don't acknowledge emotions, but it's really not. There's not that word the way we think about it. And I think when we can understand the Buddha's approach to this, it's really very kind of, it really is a revelation to us when we understand Buddha's very specific approach. And that's what we've got to realize, you know. I mean, we know words like love, compassion, kindness, emotional awareness, empathy, stability. We know these words. We know them so well. And these are all the words of Buddhist psychology. I mean, not like in Western psychology, all the brand new words we've created the last God knows how many years, you know. They're not the terms Buddhism uses, and Buddhism hasn't changed its tune in 2,500 years. I mean, so really Buddhism's either very stubborn, stuck in the past, or how it still talks is relevant. And it's very often, even as Buddhists, you know, many of us Buddhists studying for years and practicing for years, we really don't know the Buddhist view of the mind because we haven't studied it. So because we hear the word love, attachment, anxiety, jealousy, we assume we all have the same definition. But the Buddha's view is so specific, you know. Quite unique in many, quite unique. In the first way, in describing the states of mind. But second, the really crucial piece that plays the role in our practice is the causes of what goes on in our mind. The causes, you know. So from the Buddhist point of view too, we can look at the bigger picture and see there's many ways of entering into Buddhism. You can very comfortably say, validly say, it is a series of methods for how to stop suffering and get happy. That's the most tasty for us. It's also a method of how to stop being ignorant and how to get wisdom. That sounds a bit more abstract. Who wants to get wisdom? Not sure about that, you know. Sounds okay. You understand? But not so exciting. We'd rather have happiness, please. And then another way is definitely it's a system of ethics, a system of morality, of ethics. It's exactly that. But what's fascinating, these three different ways of presenting Buddhism come to the same thing. And that's a surprise. So, you know, we talk about wisdom in our culture, and we think of geniuses. We think of genius mathematicians or genius, you know, musicians, genius artists. We never think of it in terms of ethics. It's sort of, well, we think they're nice if they've also got good ethics, but we never think of the development of that wisdom as a thing that's dependent on good ethics. That's a surprise to us. In other words, you could be this genius mathematician and go home every day and beat up your husband. You understand? We're not surprised by that. And so we value intelligence, and so we're prepared to forgive geniuses if they're a bit neurotic and mean, you know? Or forgive artists, for sure. If you're a great artist, but you're a bit of a maniac, we think, oh, that's okay because you're a great artist. But this is what's really important to understand. Is from the Buddhist point of view, it's not possible to have wisdom that the Buddha talks about without ethics. It's dependent upon ethics. They come together. And all of that practice is what brings happiness. So to understand this, it helps us, it really will give us an insight into the Buddhist approach. We've got to dig a bit deeper to understand these words, you know. So we all know the word awareness. We mightn't be sure about emotional awareness. That's maybe something we think about these more recently. But awareness just means, you know, observing something, noticing something, seeing something. That we get. And we are actually good at it. We're absolutely ingenious when it comes to knowing mathematics, understanding the intricacy, the subtlety of all the mathematical things, you know, of music. Look at the amazing genius of incredible musicians, the clarity and brilliance of their awareness. You know, anybody who's... So they're the things we're very familiar with, and we get that, and we use our energy and our enthusiasm and our wisdom to accomplish those things. But we don't think that way when it comes to psychology. We think it when it comes to physics. Of all the sciences in the world, we admire most, of all the bodies of knowledge, we admire most scientific these days. I think psychology is the lowest on the totem pole. Because there's no real, I think it doesn't seem like in our culture, any real agreement on what the mind is and where it comes from and how it functions. And then we don't trust psychology because it's subjective, you know. So we don't really, and philosophy just seems a bit sort of, you know, whimsical. Every week someone comes up with a new philosophy. And then secondly, we don't think philosophy is what you practice. You fill your head with many views about how things are and become very wise and, you know, and chat away about how things are. But the Buddha's view, again, it is philosophy, it is psychology, it is metaphysics, and is it all, and it's all practice, and it all comes to the same thing. It also all comes down to the mind. For the Buddha, the mind is central. That means we have to understand what he means by it, because we can be forgiven for thinking we all know what that means, but we have to get his definition. And it's so radically different in many respects, in what it is in its nature, its source, its function, and its potential. Absolutely fundamentally nothing like Buddha's view in our modern culture. So that's why if we want to understand Buddhism, and how we don't have to be a Buddhist, just you can use it, you can use Buddhism, you can be a 1% Buddhist, you know, no one says you can't. But you've got to know what he means by it. You can't put your interpretation, that's just rude, you know. So the end result of Buddhist philosophy, psychology, metaphysics, practice, methods for getting happy, ethics, you name it, or the result the final result is the achievement of Buddha, Sangye in Tibetan. That's the end result of applying Buddha's methodology. If you go all the way as far as you can go, you'd end up being a Buddha. Sangye. And the concept is very simple. The etymology of the Tibetan word is very delicious. Sang implies the utter eradication And these words are too shocking, but I'll say them exactly, and this is exactly what Buddha's saying. But we can't hear this because there's nothing equivalent in our psychology, in our science. The Sang, Buddha, Sang implies the utter eradication from one's mind. Tibetans always point here. Consciousness, mind, of all ego, all fears, all neurosis, all low self-esteem, all the nonsense, all the stuff that we know is painful. As soon as we say the words, anger, attachment, neurosis, low self-esteem, whatever words you like. This stuff, for the Buddha, is his key finding. They say it's adventitious. Meaning here, not at the core of our being. Therefore, can be removed. Well, these words aren't complicated, but the concept, my God, it doesn't exist for us. It does not exist in science. There's no neuroscientist would say those words. In other words, because the brain is the mind, there's no piece of the brain that we think we have to cut out to stop all the suffering. That, like I joke and say we tried that in the 30s, we called it lobotomies. It didn't work, So there's no equivalent. So we've got to hear, if we're going to take Buddhism seriously, even if you're not going to be a Buddhist, but take it as a serious body of knowledge, which has been around for thousands of years, coming from these amazing Indians before him, then if we want to respect it, we've got to know what the definitions are. If you're an allopathic medical person, which is the common one in our culture, you can't just leap into acupuncture and use your own definitions and kind of squeeze it into your system. You've got to put your system aside and learn this whole new body of knowledge with its new definitions and new reference points and new framework. You can't just squeeze it into some other view, There's many ways of seeing things. We get that. So the word Ge, Sangye, Buddha, not only can we rid the mind of all the nonsense, we can develop to perfection, this is exact for the Buddha, all the other stuff in here. Love, kindness, compassion, joy, you name it. These words are so simple, but this is exactly the end result. Now, if we were to sit here and describe the qualities of a Buddha, we'd think we're in science fiction. We'd go home. We'd just think it's a load of nonsense. So we won't go there. We could say it. I'm just joking. I'm not joking. Because we'd be so astonishing having done this job. The qualities of a being who's accomplished this, which Buddha happens to have found for himself, from his own experience, that this is the nature, the potential of every single living being, be kind of mind-blowing. But just hear the words even. And this is the point. This already implies, the end result implies the method. If you're trying to even, forget about ridding the mind totally of the rubbish, even just to think that, wow, I can get less neurotic, less depressed, less angry, less anxious, less suffering. Because for Buddha, he identifies this stuff as the source of our suffering, the main source. This is all the exact Buddha's words. So it's kind of encouraging to think this. He's got methods to help us get less suffering and more happy. Wow, thank you very much. But his methodology, his view even of the word happiness, his view of the word suffering, his view of the word mind, his view of the causes of suffering, they're what are different. They are so different. And to get Buddha, we've got to understand what he means. Otherwise, how can we apply it, So if it is true that our consciousness, our mind, I, have the potential, to be less neurotic, therefore more happy, thank you, then I'd better know what he means by those words. I better dig deep, I've got to know what he means by the mind. So the first point for the Buddha in the mind, for the Buddha, the first point, and this is taking from the big picture point of view. Many people who practice some Buddhist techniques like mindfulness and all these different things we talk about from within the context of being a materialist, a philosophical materialist, you don't have to think about this bigger picture at all. You don't need to. There's so much you can do with Buddhism without looking at the bigger picture. But I like the big picture. So we're going to discuss the big picture too. We're going to discuss this emotional awareness in the framework of the big picture. So from the big picture point of view, which means the whole entire world view that in fact is Buddhism, which often is a surprise to us. We don't think it's a world view. It's a vast body of knowledge of philosophy, metaphysics, as I'm saying, about the universe, about the world, about happiness, suffering, beings, what is it, all that. all of those things. It is all that. It is all that coming in this integrated way from the thousands of years before on the basis of all the amazing findings of these ingenious Indians before the Buddha, you know. As His Holiness said, it was these amazing Indians more than 3,000 years ago who were the ones who first began the investigation into the nature of self. We probably thought it was Freud, you know, being so arrogant in our modern culture. I mean, we're absolutely ignorant. I keep saying it, and only lately have I realised that we're so utterly ignorant of these amazing genius Indians in their culture, and their history, and their philosophy, you know. Astonishing. Absolutely mind-boggling, you know. So, okay. So from the Buddhist point of view, first and foremost, your mind is not your brain. And that's not going to insult neuroscientists. It's not even contradicting what they say. This is why the Dalai Lama and his amazing conversations the last 40 years, organised by the Mind and Life organisation, bringing these views, seemingly opposite views, together, finding continuity. Fantastic. It's so amazing. So it's a wake-up call for so many us, you know, modern philosophical materialists, philosophical materialists. So, okay, it's not your brain. It's not physical. It doesn't mean the brain doesn't play a role. Clearly it does. But he's not discussing the brain. You ask these genius yogis thousands of years ago where their brain was, they'd say they have never heard of such a thing. But they know their minds intimately. That's their expertise. That's Buddha's expertise. Meaning, here, then, if it's not physical, so forget that one, but say that. Nevertheless, so what do we mean by the mind? It's a much more subjectively used word. It's referring to our actual thoughts, feelings, emotions, unconscious, subconscious, this entire spectrum of our inner being, stuff that we are ignorant about, that we notice most of the time until it's vomiting out our mouth. This is Buddha's expertise. His ability on the basis of getting single-pointed concentration, this ingenious technique invented by the Indians well before the Buddha, that enable us to get this amazing disciplined, subtle focus that enables us to plumb the depths of our own mind that we don't even posit as existing, to unpack, so we can unpack and unravel its contents and eventually do the job of lessening and eventually ridding it of all the nonsense and developing and growing to perfection all the goodness. Speaking simply, that is the job of a Buddhist, from here to the end result. So, the next point that's different about the mind, like we just already indicated, is this potential, this insane potential to be rid of all the rubbish and full of all the goodness, to be free of suffering and full of happiness. Not physical, has far more subtle levels of cognition, of capacity for cognition, has the potential to rid the mind, to be utterly free of all nonsense which is causing suffering and full of all, whatever, the wisdom and clarity and all the rest. This is our natural potential, Buddha says, long term. And the other way it's different, of course, is the radically different point that disagrees fundamentally, at least in one way, with the one view that we would say that the creator religious philosophies and the materialist philosophies at least agree upon, that you began in your mother's womb. If God made you, you began in your mother's womb. If your mummy and daddy made you, you began in your mother's womb. Buddha disagrees with both of those findings. But he says that's a mistake. He doesn't agree with that. He says our consciousness, as mad as this sounds, it's the product of the law of cause and effect. Like everything we know is the product of the law of cause and effect. Very simple. If you have this, at any given moment, whatever this might be, it's got its own series of causes, and the first most simple logic is it comes from a previous moment of that stuff. It's like the chicken and egg idea, you know. So consciousness for the Buddha, like all phenomena, is a product of cause and effect, which means this moment of this cup, the stuff that it is, its main cause is the stuff of the previous moment, and the stuff of the previous moment is the cause of the previous moment, and so on and so forth. And if you kept tracking back that cup, you'd end up at the first moment of the Big Bang. Because each moment of whatever that stuff is, whether it's labelled cup or the stuff that makes the cup, it comes from something before. It comes from something before. It comes from something before. This is kind of logical. In other words, if we take the view of cause and effect, you cannot posit such a thing as a first cause. That's a complete contradiction. It's an insanity. But that, even those simple words take time for us to hear. So given that logic, you can't find a first moment of your consciousness. Therefore, it's beginningless. I mean, even as I say it, it sounds ridiculous. But this is the only logical conclusion what the Buddha would say. Your consciousness is beginningless. So is matter. And indeed, your consciousness is also endless. And that is not how the Christians talk, and it's certainly not how the materialists talk. This is Buddha's view. And this is observation. And that's the point to keep remembering. When we think of Buddhism, we think, it's kind of like, it sounds like we like it because it doesn't sound just like a religion, but we still put it into the category called religion, and that's okay. You ask a Tibetan, am I religious? They'll say, yep. Oh, you believe in a creator? No. So our definition of religion is linked to a creator, but not for Buddhism. So the point here is, the key thing to get, and this takes a while to hear as well, that Buddha is not a creator. He doesn't assert a creator. There is no concept like that in Buddhism. Therefore, there is no concept of punishment and reward, which is how we all think about morality. One of God's jobs is to, because he runs the universe, I'm not being sarcastic here, if you have faith in God, please, I'm not going to insult you. Necessarily, I mean, speaking very simple terms, the concept of a boss, God is the boss. God created me, he created the laws of morality, he created the universe, so necessarily God is to be obeyed. And this is the view, I mean, of my Catholic priest friend, when I asked him, what is a sin by definition? He said it is by definition doing what God said not to do. Well, that's our view of morality in my mother's household. When she says, do that. And I'll say, why? We know her answer, because I say so. That's the view of the world. That's why, the police, the judges, the laws, your boss, your mummy, God, it's the same. Someone's the boss, they run the show, they hold the power to punish and reward. That's our view of ethics. We have that instinctively. There's no concept like that in Buddhism. Buddha's not a creator. Therefore, he's not a boss. Therefore, he's not the punisher or a rewarder. Therefore, there's no punishment and no reward. There's no person wielding a big stick, in other words, which is how we think about it. But for the Buddha, if there's cause and effect, there are consequences to what we do. Naturally, if you sow a seed in the ground called an apple seed, you won't get a pear. You'll get an apple. There's logic to cause and effect. So you learn the laws, you test it, you get the result, you can replicate it every time. That's the Buddha's view. That's his expertise as far as he's concerned, when it comes to getting happiness and stopping suffering. Because he says he's identified the causes of suffering, so that once we apply that, we can get rid of suffering and get happiness. This is Buddha's teachings. This is Buddha's methodology. So where's it come from? Well, I say it's true, I joke, but it's true. We all ask the same questions. And that's, for me, very, very consoling, actually. All over the planet, wherever I go, we ask the same questions. But there's only one question ever, so far, still, I've had once, from one person, a scientist in New Zealand. And he said, who revealed the teachings to the Buddha? Which is a perfect question when it comes to creative religions. Perfect. And then he was shocked when I gave the answer. I said, nobody. What do you mean? I said, would you ask Einstein who revealed the teachings about relativity to him? Of course you wouldn't. You'd laugh. You know that Einstein's information comes from his own observation. And he's presenting it. And he says, here is what I found to be so. He's not asking us to believe it. We know he didn't have a vision of it yesterday and is now telling us about it. We know he's not speculating. He says, this is my findings. Here is my methodology. If you'd like to come to the same conclusion, follow the steps that I did. That's a Buddha. And I'm not being sarcastic. I'm not joking. That is exactly the approach in Buddhism. But it really takes us time to hear that. It really takes us time to hear, because we have all these assumptions that, let's say, in the bigger picture point of view, that consciousness, reincarnation, all this stuff, karma, this is religion, therefore is made up by a creator, therefore can't be proved. We have that assumption. Well, that's not Buddha's view. He's not a creator. He didn't make it up. He's observed it. How? With his mind, which is more subtle. Remember that. You've got to remember the Buddhist view of the mind. It goes to these more subtle levels, which means it has the capacity to cognize things at a subtler level, such as the past, the future, etc. This fits completely with the Buddhist view in psychology. If you were to study it, you'd learn all that. You have to believe it. Buddha's not asking you to believe it, nor is Einstein. You prove it. And if you disprove it, as the Dalai Lama said, then great, Buddha's happy. Bye-bye, Buddha, I'm out of here. If you go along and practice his methodology and you get to a point where you see that he's wrong in his findings, then of course you will find that to be true and he'll be very happy to hear it. That's what he did with the Hindus. He went as far as he could go, and he found that they were wrong in their final conclusion. So he kept moving. He didn't chuck out what he'd learned already. He kept moving. That's how you do with Einstein. Just the same. We call that science. That's the Buddhist approach, as surprising as that is to us. So our mind is not physical. Our mind is not the handiwork of a creator or mummy or daddy. That's a big surprise. It's a result, it's a continuity of mental moments. Beginningless and endless. That sounds ridiculous initially, but it's all there in the findings. It's up to us to look into it. It's got these far more subtle levels of cognition that we, in the long term, to do this job that he says we have to do, want to do, if we do it, to perfect the mind and rid the mind of rubbish, we've got to access these subtler levels of mind. Using these amazing techniques invented by these Indians before the Buddha, that the Buddhism uses, are central to Buddhism still. Single point of concentration, shamatha. And that the delusions in the mind, the neuroses in the mind, are adventitious. They can be removed. This is the essence of Buddhism. And all the methodology are rooted in all of this. Let's look at it now from the point of view of how we start. How do we start then? If it's true, we can change our mind. If it's true, we can lessen our neuroses. And again, remember, this is the crucial one, is why would I want to do that? And this is one of our main stumbling blocks. Why would I want to do that? From the Buddhist perspective, because they're the source of your suffering. This is massive. We could spend the whole day just on that topic, because that's not how we think. So that flies in the face of our deep assumptions, because as far as I'm concerned, I am suffering because Martin did this, or Mary did that, or the weather did this. And our science reinforces that with respect. That's the dualistic view. That's the samsaric view. That's our philosophical view. That's the view we live in and exist in and reinforce every second of the day. And Buddha says we're missing a fundamental point. We're missing the role of our mind. So, we all know we want to be happy. I mean, speaking really simply, don't get all fancy and intellectual about it. We want pleasant feelings and we don't want unpleasant feelings. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. And this word happiness and suffering, they're very interesting. Let's look at those. From the psychological model, from the point of view of the Buddhist model of how they describe the internal qualities in here. They talk about, in the West we say we've got 1,000 thoughts a second. Buddha agrees with that. But in the Buddhist model, you talk about sensory consciousness and we talk about mental consciousness. And this is a really crucial distinction, by the way, that's very helpful to even understand initially. As Lama says, we make the body the boss, meaning that because we think we are only the body, everything for us is physical. The way our body experiences things second by second is how we determine happiness and suffering, basically. The second there's a pain in your knee, the mind gets distressed. The second the weather's pleasant, your mind gets happy. So we can see the role. Well, that's the wrong one. It's about the body. The second the body feels certain things, then we base our happiness and suffering on that. And the Buddha says we're giving way too much power to the body. That's not being, that's not being mean. Practical. As Lama says, we make the body the boss. Complete mistake for the Buddha. So we've got sensory consciousness and we have mental consciousness. So how do we distinguish those? Well, again, speaking clearly, using Buddha's view, consciousness or mind, synonymous, virtually, not physical. So I consciousness. That part of my mind that functions through the eyeball. The nerves, all the bits and pieces working together. The physical part of me is not what cognizes its objects. It's the consciousness mixed with the physical that allows me to have an I consciousness, a moment of cognition. Of what? So every part of our mind, whatever part of our mind is functioning, its function is to cognize. That's the actual definition of mind, that which cognizes. So everything is always the mind is always cognizing something. And we have to, and one of the major ones when we study Buddhist psychology is to identify clearly the object of each of our states of mind. Because Buddha's saying that we're misconceiving things now. So I consciousness It's got more capacity than this, but in general, eye consciousness has two objects. It cognizes shape and colour. That's it. Ear consciousness cognizes sound. Tactile, tongue and nose, 5 senses. They've each got their own function, each got their own objects that they cognize. Then you have mental consciousness. So in all the teachings, there's more. The senses can do more things, but in general, when we look at the simple function of eye consciousness, it has 2 objects: shape and colour. But I will say, wow, and I do, because I got it yesterday. Craig bought it for me, and I'm all excited and attached to my new cup, my travel cup. I wanted a thin, black, with no words on it, thermos cup, and now he found one for me. So I'm already attached to it, already. So what I see is a really nice cup. I see that, But that's, Buddha says, don't be ridiculous. I'm sorry. The shape and colour here, my eye consciousness cognizes shape and colour. So then you've got to ask the question logically, what part of my mind goes, wow, what a gorgeous cup, You understand? Well, that's my mental consciousness. That's where the workshop is, as Lama Zopa says. That's the Buddha's expertise, to unpack and unravel this. This is where the workshop is. This is where the suffering is. This is where the happiness is. This is where the potential is. This is what we have to learn to understand, the mental consciousness. This is Buddha's expertise. So, then in the mental consciousness, then what happens is my eyes see that shape and colour in a millionth of a second, and I'm really not joking, quicker than Google. It accesses mental consciousness, and up comes a story. Well, the very first time I saw it, because David took us around yesterday to about 4 shops, and Kind, Zarina and Anne-Marie went around, we looked at 20 cups and about 100 online. None of them suited me. I knew what I wanted. And Craig randomly goes across the road and buys the one cup that he sees, and it's the perfect cup, So straight away, as soon as my eyes saw it, I instantly checked, isn't it, against what I want. And except for this dent here, which I think is rather nice now. I admire the designer who did that, because it helps you hold it better. It was very wise of the designer. I appreciate that now. In the beginning, I didn't like it. I thought, no, I don't want that dent. Do you understand? And then I looked inside, and there's this extra layer here, and I thought that's really extra messy, but then now I appreciate it, and I appreciate the designer. They really thought it through. I so admire. So all that happened in the beginning, so now I've got this picture in my mind, my pretty cup, my delicious cup. Where's my cup, I'm going to say? Where's my cup, Do you understand? We all know this, right? All of that is mental consciousness. It's these elaborate conceptual stories that we are every second are making up. Every day, new stories, new conceptions, new thoughts, new opinions. It's a great big bunch of opinions in here. But basically, as one Lama said, we're like children who draw a lion. We create it. But then we become afraid of it. We completely forgot we created it. So in the beginning, all that process of me analysing the cup and looking and checking, yes, this and no, that, and now it's just merged into my cup, delicious cup. And I forget that it's my concepts, based on what I want, what I think, what I like best, all my concepts, my things, my this, I want black and blah. All of that is elaborate conceptual, conceptual story. Elaborate conceptual story. All of it, a bunch of thoughts. We can kind of see this. Buddha is a cognitive therapist. He's the most ingenious cognitive therapist you can find. And because they're all just a bunch of thoughts, he says we can change them, because we made them up in the first place. The trouble is, he says, we've been thinking these thoughts for eons, and so now they're totally entrenched as absolute truth for us. Which is why we have a panic attack when things aren't what we want. And this is why we have to understand the way the neurotic states of mind function. But they're all conceptual stories. And this is to really begin to understand the word emotions, we've got to understand this deeper point. That and this we're going to be discussing, when we go beyond, we've got to go beyond the emotional component, which is when the body is involved. That's the only time we notice what's happening in our mind, when our body tells us something's going on, because we're so gross in our awareness. We think it's subtle to notice your body. No, it's the tip of the iceberg. The body's the last part of us, the grossest level. We've got stuff in the mind that's so subtle, so deep, so entrenched, so ancient. We've got to go deep in, and that is an abstract concept for us. We don't get that, you know. And what we normally think that means is looking into the past, what mummy did and what daddy did and when I was 2 or 3. That's not what Buddha's saying. He's not saying look into the past. It's helpful if you can, but that's what we do in our culture because we think all the sources of me are back there. Why am I angry? Because of what happened when I was a little girl. That we're convinced we'll find this needle in a haystack. Ah, now we know why Robina gets jealous, gets angry. That's what happened to her. That's how we think. Buddha disagrees with that logic. He's not saying it doesn't play a role, but we give all the power to that because we believe, and that's our scientific model, that we are the product of mother and father and genes and DNA. And we go back to mummy, daddy, grandma, grandpa, and back to the monkeys. That's the only place we know where to look. Buddha says, no, you look in the mind, deep down, down, unpack, unravel, deeper, 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 deeper. We can't get that concept. So it's a very different approach, such a different approach, you know. We've got to go beyond the emotional component. This is the tip of the iceberg. It's just the indicator that something's going on in here. So, the mental consciousness is what we have to become familiar with, and that's when you study Buddhist psychology, that's what you're studying. The Buddhist model of the mind, the way the mental consciousness functions. And we're not discussing the brain. So the Buddhist view, and this is again coming from these Indians, this is thousands of years old. The Buddha, you know, they've tweaked it over the centuries. People got variations in their definitions, but pretty much it's stable for several thousand years, this view. And where has this information come from? This is the big question. Not revelation, not with a microscope on a brain, but with a microscope of your own mind, in your own mind itself. They map the mind internally. This is something weird to us. We can't get it. Based on brilliant, ingenious, single point of concentration and the knowledge of the mind, the contents, you know. So, we can say there's many ways of presenting how the mind functions, the way the mind works, you know, what's the contents and how and what they are. But here, a really good way to put it is that he divides all the contents of our mind, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of different types of thoughts. That's how he says, conceptions. Into 3 categories. There's no 4th category. And the 4th 2 are the crucial ones. The 3rd category are I like to call it the mechanics of our mind. They're the parts of our mind that enable us to do the job of unpacking and unraveling. They're the part of our mind that everybody needs to do anything. If you want to be a good sniper, you need very good concentration, you need really clear awareness, you've got to pay attention, you've got to know exactly the distinction between that person and this person, otherwise you'll kill the wrong person. You've got to have good attention, good awareness, good discrimination, good concentration, good mindfulness. They're in the 3rd category. They're the mechanics of the mind. Whether you're a murderer or a meditator, they've got to be functioning properly. So they're not in their nature good or bad, in the sense that Buddha would refer to the first 2 types of states of mind that they use very simply, refer to them as very simply negative and positive, non-virtuous and virtuous. Now we get nervous about these words because it sounds like religion, doesn't it? And it sounds like judgment. And in psychology we don't like to judge people. It's not judgment, it's just a proper label. You know, in a garden, you don't say, oh no, you can't call that a weed. You can't judge. You're very stupid. If you can't call it a weed and know a herb or a weed, you'll die if you eat the wrong one. We think of it as moralistic. It's so silly, it's so emotional, and so childish. Buddha says there's a bunch of stuff in our mind, that the stuff that we can get rid of is neurotic, deluded, disturbing. They're conceptions at a deepest level, and they're misconceptions. This is his point. So to understand that is the revelation that then gives us insight into how the Buddhist view works and how therefore you apply it in daily life. Then you've got the 2nd category. They're the good ones, the nice ones, the virtuous ones, the happy ones, the positive ones, the beneficial ones. Love, compassion. Nobody says, oh, don't you judge that person, say they're a nice person. Don't you judge that person, call them loving. Come on. We're so silly, we're so ridiculous. So the Buddha happens to say there's a bunch of states of mind in here that break our heart. They're the source of our own pain. But we hear it as punitive and judgmental, and I'm bad. That's what we put onto it. He's not saying that, but we hear that. That's our mistake. So the job of being a Buddhist, which is implied by the end result, is to distinguish between the neuroses and the virtues. It's to know the difference between a weed and a herb. Not complicated. That's what you're trying to do. That's the point of Buddhist psychology. That's what you want when you have emotional awareness. To label what's there. But you have the view of judging and being scared to say it because you might blame the person, then you're not going to get far. Part of the process of knowing your own mind is indeed to step back and simply observe there's anger, observe there's jealousy, or indeed observe there's compassion without judging. That's part of a process. It's very good to do that, to step out instead of all the neurotic interpretation of it. That's necessary. But often the biggest misinterpretation of Buddhist psychology, and therefore meditation, is that you just leave it there. This is nihilism. Oh no, you don't. One person, I remember a group of people in one country were amazing, all going in to help people in prisons, And they were talking about the different types of meditation they were doing. And this is one of the types of meditation. Buddha would suggest it. It's coming from Buddhism. But people think it's everything, So you sit and observe the thoughts and the emotions. There's anger, there's jealousy, there's love, there's this. That's fantastic. You must do that. There's a weed, there's a herb. And then I said to her, well, then what do you do next? How do you advise them next? Oh, no, you just leave it there. I said, oh, well, that's interesting. You're driving on the freeway at 120 kilometres an hour, and you notice you're driving in the wrong lane. And you just leave it there? You don't make a decision to act? Oh, no, that's judging. Well, excuse me, don't be nihilistic. You don't just look at your garden and go, oh, there's a weed. What will you do about it? Oh, no, you don't say that. Excuse me, you've got to have an action point. The only reason to call something is to decide if you want it or don't want it. It's pretty reasonable, and we get that when it comes to maths, science, cooking. If the recipe says 1 teaspoon, but you put a half in, and someone says no, it's supposed to, you're not supposed to have a half. Well, don't you tell me, or don't you insult me? I'm allowed to put a half a teaspoon if I want. Well, you won't get a cake. But when it comes to emotions, we're like less than infantile. We can't bear what sounds like judgment and criticism, because that's the tragedy of ego. We're so fragile. And this is what we have to recognize. We are fragile. We can't stand pointing out what sounds like a mistake. We can't. It literally makes us mad. This is the major stumbling block. So when we hear Buddhist teachings very simply presented that anger, depression, anxiety, attachment are the cause of your suffering, we just can't hear it. It seems like too mean, too unkind of Buddha. He's so brutal. So we hear, I'm bad, we beat ourselves up, we become guilty, neurotic. Well, anyway, that. We just increases when we hear Buddha, That's not meant to be that's not meant to be the attitude at all. I mean, if you go to your doctor, and she wisely says that she's found from her own experience that cancer can come from smoking too many cigarettes. So she advises you out of kindness, maybe even sternly, you've got to give up those fags, Robina. You call them fags in Sweden? Used to anyway. Smoking is not ubiquitous now, is it? When I smoked, the whole world smoked. Everybody smoked. So you can manage to smoke 80 a day, but now you couldn't even smoke more than one, because everyone's going to put you in prison, isn't it? I can't imagine trying to smoke now. I smoked normal, 40 Marlboros a day was normal. Then when I was really extreme, when I was on speed, I'd smoke 80. I'm serious. In between the marijuana. Truly, I did. Anyway, whatever, now you can't, it's possible. So imagine, the doctor, you don't say, how dare you insult me? How dare you criticize me? How dare you say you're going to punish me with cancer? We don't say that, do we? But we say it when it comes to looking into our mind. Isn't that fascinating? We have such a different approach when it comes to looking in our mind. We're practical when it comes to food. We know things will harm us. So we kindly, out of compassion to ourselves, will stop smoking cigarettes. Equally, you don't think your doctor's going to punish you with cancer. That's our view of morality. God will punish me. Mummy will punish me. The judge will punish me. That's why we try to hide our bad qualities, because we don't want to get punished. That's our view. We imposed all that view. That's a dualistic nonsense view that Buddha disagrees with fundamentally, but that really takes time to get to. We've got to have courage to want to look into our mind because we are sick of the suffering. We are sick of the suffering. We're sick of the neurosis and up and down like yo-yos, you know. That's the reason you want to look into your mind. So you have to have courage to do that because it means you're going to have to look at the shit in there. Like one of my friends is a therapist and a Buddhist. He said it's having your hands in your own shit. It's a fact. It's not comfortable. But we have to be brave to own it because that's what's breaking our hearts. That's what's causing us our misery. And these words again are easy, but it's hard to hear because it's not what we think. I think Martin is the cause of my suffering. And I think he's the cause of my happiness. It's the same. You blame him for both. Why are you happy, Robina? Oh, Martin's so kind. Why are you suffering, Robina? Oh, Martin's so mean. We blame him for my suffering and we blame him for my happiness. So we put in other words, we put it on the outside. That's the dualistic view we all have. And that's deep in our bones. No one taught us that. That's samsara, Buddha says. And that comes from ancient habit of misconceptions over countless lives. That's why at least even the talk of reincarnation and past lives gives power to this idea the Buddha says that we're programmed with this stuff in the depths of our bones. It's not enough to look at what happened when you were 1. You came programmed already, Buddha says, from the first second of conception. With your own past, not mummy's and daddy's past. But they both agree we come from the past. But the West says mummy's and daddy's past. Buddha says our own past. That's what we have to look at. And that's where karma comes in, which we're going to talk about. So we have to want. Because we want the logic is in the first stages of practice. We're not discussing compassion here. We have to want to stop suffering and we have to want to be happy. That's the impetus that gives us the wish to want to look into the mind. There's no other reason. There's no other reason. There's no other reason. It's because you're sick of suffering. And really, so the first stage is like compassion for yourself. But we miss that one. We completely miss that. When we think of spiritual, we always think of compassion, you know. That comes later. That's advanced. You can't possibly have compassion for anybody until you start to know how you work, how you function, what causes your suffering, what your delusions are. Then you know yourself, then you know others. It's logical, you know. So the impetus for wanting to look into our mind, for wanting to get emotional balance is your own sanity, your own happiness. You've got to want that in a really good, delighted way. Don't be ashamed of that. Then you can help others. That comes next. So, these 3 categories of states of mind. There's no fourth in this mental consciousness. The neuroses, all the ego-based ones, all the distorted, deluded, distorted, deluded, disturbing states of mind. Then you've got the valid, virtuous states of mind. Then you have this third lot, I like to call them mechanics. Concentration, all these things, right? So starting again, if we want to be happy and don't want suffering, let's get clear what Buddha means by those words. This is huge. So for this we look into the 4 Noble Truths. Really it's best to call them the 4 facts for the noble ones. The truths aren't noble, but they call it that's the 4 facts for the noble ones. And truth always sounds a bit like religion to me, so I prefer the word facts. Sounds very, doesn't it? The facts. The 4 facts for the noble ones. This is Buddha's first teaching, and they're all in reference to suffering. There is suffering. There are causes. You can get rid of it. Here's the method. Pretty simple. Of course, it's presented in a much more complex way, and you read it and you drown in confusion because it's so complex and so, complex. But simply speaking, he's identified that there is suffering. He's identified the causes, which is a miracle, really. And he says you can get rid of them. That's even more amazing. And there's how to do it, the 4th one. That's it. So what's suffering? Well, the first one, there's 3 levels, he says. Different ways of presenting, but one way is in terms of 3 levels of suffering. The grossest level, the more subtle, and the most subtle. So the first one is what we all agree on is suffering. It's easy. When the bad things happen. Not complicated. When the bad things happen. This is easy to say, and we can all agree on this one. Monks and dogs also agree. They what we call suffering is when the bad things happen. And what the bad things means is when they're the things that I don't want, isn't it? So if someone likes carrot cake, then that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. And if I don't like carrot cake, then that's a bad thing. So I suffer when carrot cake comes, and Martin's happy when carrot cake comes. Because we all have our assumptions, don't we, what we want and what we don't want. Well, putting Buddha's words to those words, it's called attachment. This powerful, for him it's a neurotic, not the word you think of attachment. Don't use your definition. Being close to your family, being attached to your children, that's not what Buddha means. He's talking a neurotic, distorted, disturbing, primordially deep misconception at the level of assumption, ancient in us, that basically is this, it's multifaceted. And it's a deep assumption, panic-stricken assumption, that I must get what I want every millisecond. That's what it is, essentially. When it comes down to it, that's it. And it's completely programmed in us. Where from? Not from mummy and daddy practicing it, but from our own practice in the past. We come fully programmed. The Buddha identifies in the first of the three kinds of states of mind, in the negative ones, he identifies 84,000 distinct, different delusions, distinct, different misconceptions, distinct, the term they use in Buddhist psychology, or mental illnesses, which is a really good translation. Well, that's pretty shocking to hear that. 84,000, but he luckily, helpfully narrows it down to 3 that are the source of all the others, which is really helpful. And there he calls them the 3 poisons, or we can call them the 3 toxic emotions. Wonderful phrase we use in English these days. And there's a hierarchical relationship between them. And again, this is not how we talk in our world. The root delusion, which we'll get to, we'll see, is known simply as ignorance, or known colloquially as ego grasping, and it's the root of all our problems, such that when that's uprooted, we've achieved our liberation, Not all the way to Buddha yet, but we're on the way. This is really the primordial misconception of our very own self. And it's fear-based. It's panic-stricken fear-based. They're all fear-based. This ego grasping is so primordial. So on the basis of that, its main voice in daily life is attachment. This panic-stricken emotional hunger, this assumption, this frantic, panic-stricken assumption every millisecond that I must get what I want. Another way to say it is to get the nice things. What I mean by nice. That's it. That's it. That's attachment. And it's got all these different facets, But that's its essence. And Buddha says it drives everything we do every second. And to the degree that we have it is the degree to which we suffer. We've all got it until you're highly realised. It's just there. It's just the deal. It's samsara. So on the basis of that first one, ego grasping, its main voice is attachment to get what that supposed I wants. And on the basis of attachment, not getting what it wants. That is aversion. Attachment, aversion. And we go between these 1,000 times a day, like drunken sailors. Attachment's the assumption that wants what I want every second, and the millisecond it doesn't get it. Panic attack. Aversion, and that can be from anger, annoyance, frustration, irritation, upset, despair, depression, and the whole spectrum. That's all expressions of aversion, and that's the expression of attachment not getting what it wants. Aversion is the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants. These words are simple, but we don't recognize this process. And this is happening all the time at the deepest level in all of us. So if we have 1,000 thoughts a second, it's very clear we're not aware of them. And this is why this is not the level to which Buddha says we can have emotional awareness, not to mental awareness, subtler awareness, is dependent completely on getting single point of concentration. In the long term, the big picture. Without this, we just stumble along. There's masses we can accomplish without getting single point of concentration. But to really progress in the way he says we have to, need to, we need concentration. Then it's like unbelievably easy. So we're really fighting an uphill battle when our mind is so chaotic and we don't have any focus. But that's normal world. But there's still a lot we can do to get the level of awareness Buddha says we're capable of. So we have to start somewhere, obviously. So understanding these three toxic emotions is completely fundamental to understanding Buddhism. If you don't get this, you don't get Buddhism. You're just making up your own story, you know. And these are the summary of the other 84,000. They all subsume to these three, and the three is subsumed to the one, ego grasping. Are we communicating? So let's have some questions before we continue. What's the time? Based on what I've said so far, ask me some questions. Well, it's only an hour, we're fine. Yes.
Hi, Venerables. Thank you. I have a question. If you can elaborate a little bit more the aversion. I didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I will definitely. I'll do that. I will do that. Any more questions? More questions? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question related to that. Like, I'm trying to just understand that the distinction between aversion and angry. Well, no.
Yeah, good. I understand.
Like this,
I will.
the same.
Absolutely, I will.
Because I don't really understand why it's a
understand.
third. Because
Yes.
I kind of get.
We'll go into it. Absolutely, thank you. Any more? Just before we go into this? Yes.
I was wondering if it's possible then to get free of this.
Get what?
To become free of being like stuck with aversion and.
But that's what I said in the beginning.
Yes.
That's what I said in the beginning.
But if you please let me finish the question.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Is it possible to become free of that if you just live in like
To become what, darling?
society?
To become what? I didn't. Forgive me, I didn't hear you.
I was thinking if it's possible to get the
do this job.
To do this job, yes.
Yeah.
If you live in this normal society.
I understand. No, utterly and completely impossible for 99.99% of us. Not because we don't have the potential, but we're not living an ordinary daily life with objects of attachment and objects of anger and children and mortgages and wages and this and worries and fears and pains and bodies. It's impossible. We've got to give up sex, drugs and rock and roll, have years and years of practice under our belt, get some single point of concentration, and then, then we can achieve it quickly. We can go really far. But what I said before is, of course, to really get somewhere, there's levels and levels and levels, isn't there? If you want to become like Lance Armstrong and win the what do you call it? Grand Prix on the bike. You can't just be a weekend cyclist, can you? So it's asking, can I be like Lance Armstrong by living an ordinary life? The answer is no. It's obvious. Can I be like Bach? And, he had 22 children and he wrote like countless pieces of music every month just to keep the children fed. Can I do that? No, we don't have the we don't have the ability and the genius, and we don't have the space and time. So everything's levels of capability, isn't it? Do you understand? So you can do cycling a little bit every day and get somewhere with it and grow it and grow it. So you can look at your mind every single day, and that's what we're talking here. I'm giving the big picture as a reference point for what we can do every day. So to the degree to which we have any will to do it is, of course, the degree to which we will do something, and we can get results. We can be very optimistic. That's the big Does that make sense to you? Good, okay. It's contextual. Do you understand? So now let's look into attachment and aversion and the relationship between these two and what they are. Okay? So we say the word anger, you hear that one, don't you? So describe what you think anger is. Tell me, how would a person look if they were angry? Describe what you see if you see an angry person. What would you see? Yeah, you. Let's just give example. You. Just describe an angry person to me. What would you be seeing?
A lion.
Huh? No, be very simple. Describe to me. You say, oh wow, you say, oh, Fred was angry yesterday, and I've never heard of anger. So what would you tell me how Fred was behaving?
Out of their mind. Like
Good. Keep saying it. What else?
Like agitated
and shouting probably.
Yeah, and
the fists going everywhere and the eyes wide.
And hijacked by a strong
emotion.
emotion.
But no, they're just you're observing a person who's kind of crazy, isn't it? They're shouting, yelling. Yeah. That's right, exactly. So you get anger, don't you? You get anger, right? Now,
but I'm Nordic in neurotic suppressing anger.
Okay, so what I'm getting at is this. So already you're making the point. Aversion is like the bare bones. Listen, I'm answering your question. Aversion is the bare bones state of mind that anger is a violent expression of. Are you hearing me? That's all. So normally when we think of anger, we only think of the people who shout and yell. Do you understand? But you can, like you said, you're Nordic and you're probably quiet. And what's your name? Esther. We'd say, oh no, Esther's not an angry. Esther's not an angry guy. You understand? But when you begin to know your mind, Esther, You know intimately all your thoughts. Maybe, this is why the good point. Let's say you got Robina, who's clearly got angry potential. You can see her energy. And when she's a little girl, that was her main default mode, right? When she didn't get what she wanted, anger, panic attack, scream, yell, shout. So it's easy to see Robina was angry, but Esther not. So now this is the point now. Let's say you record my angry 5 minutes of raving, and you write it on a piece of paper. And let's say Esther, who knows his mind well, writes down his angry thoughts. Do you understand? But doesn't express them. So you'd have 2 bits of paper with a bunch of words on them. Well, words are concepts, don't you agree? Are words concepts? It's very clear, isn't it? And so you're not hearing any shouting. And maybe even Esther's words are more violent than Robina's. Are you hearing this, people? This is making the simple point that Buddha's pointing out, that anger, yeah, the physical behaviour of anger is just the tip of the iceberg. It's the most harmful one because it harms others. That's clear. But that's all we think of as anger. So if in our world, in daily life, you don't get angry when your boyfriend or your girlfriend doesn't do the right thing, and you don't express anger when the lights are red, and you don't show it physically, but every second of your mind is responding like crazy, because that's what our mind does, then you're not going to notice, because we don't look inside for the problem, we look outside. And you're the kind of person who one day will wake up inert, in bed, unable to move, because you're now overwhelmed by depression. So depression is on the internalized spectrum of aversion. So aversion is this whole spectrum of responses when attachment doesn't get what it wants. The volatile anger, the word irritated, annoyed, frustrated, upset, everybody knows those words. You understand? They are mild levels of aversion. Then you've got depression and despair. And because we don't pay attention to what is happening here until it comes out the mouth, or until you're inert in bed and depressed, then we don't notice 99% of what's going on. Therefore, we're not in touch with what the hell is happening in our lives. Do you understand? And this is Buddha's expertise, to help us get this emotional awareness that brings us then to the more subtle awareness of all the thoughts in the mind that are going on, 1,000 thoughts a second. Are we communicating? Are we communicating here a bit better? Right, you understand now? So aversion is the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants. This is such a powerful way to say it. And we understand aversion. We understand annoyed, irritated, upset, frustrated, angry, depressed. We get all those quite well. But we don't get attachment because we don't have a similar word in our... we understand emotional hunger. We understand kind of a neurotic, a person who's very needy. They're extreme examples of attachment. We understand a person who is a junkie for alcohol or heroin or sex, but they're just extreme examples of what Buddha refers to as attachment. Attachment is this, so the spectrum of attachment, the way to describe attachment, this spectrum of it, this experience, and it's more subtle than aversion, obviously, because it's the default mode that drives the aversion. So like I said, the essence of attachment is an assumption that I must get what I want every second. So the deepest, the subtlest level of attachment then would be this feeling in us, this aching feeling of never being enough, never having enough. No matter what I get, not enough. No matter how much Martin tells me he loves me, never enough. No matter how much food I get, no matter how much music I get, no matter how much heroin I get, no matter how much whatever it is that I'm attached to that I get, it's never enough. We're bottomless pits of dissatisfaction. This is the tragedy of attachment, the deepest level. Dissatisfaction. And this is so pervasive, we don't really label it. So naturally, if we got dissatisfaction, the deepest level of attachment, the next one, the logical next step of attachment is to hanker after something. And of course, the first level of attachment is to get something out there, an object of the senses. This is obvious. That's the world we live in, isn't it? It's the objects of the 5 senses. And naturally, attachment believes there's something out there somewhere, that when I get it, it'll fill me up and bring me satisfaction. This is the assumption, all working without our analysis of it. And it happens every second. The next level of this attachment, after the hankering, you do all the searching to find the right boy, the right handbag, the right cup that fits what you think in your mind, this concept that you've built up. The right cake, the right whatever. Then what attachment does, and this is its worst crime, it grotesquely exaggerates the deliciousness of the object and its power to bring me satisfaction. This is what attachment is. This is a rough analysis of what attachment is, and it goes to the primordially deep levels. So for us, because it's utterly normal, we're all born with it, it's only for us in our modern psychology a problem when you become a junkie, when you want 27 girls a day, when you're never satisfied with 40 billion, kronas, when you're greedy. We only understand it's a problem when it's extreme. Well, Buddha's view is more nuanced, more subtle. He says having any attachment at all is a problem. This is really intense. He's much more subtle and more dramatic in his analysis of the cause of suffering and its causes. Are you with me, people? And he says we can rid our mind of it. Of course, one step at a time. Don't hold your breath, You can't become Lance Armstrong overnight, not working on the weekends either. But you can chip away at it. That's why we've got to have confidence and humility with ourselves. One day at a time. It'll be a long time before these delusions go completely, which is what he says they can, but we've got to learn to live with them, while we're working on them. And that takes courage, because we can't stand the pain. We wish they'd all go away. And that brings one of our major misconceptions about meditation. We think meditation is an alternative to a pill. In other words, we only turn to meditation when you've got a problem. Well, a gross problem. When the anger is going berserk, when the depression is unbearable, when the anxiety is running the show. It's only when it's serious do we even think there should be an a pill. Complete mistake. Wrong. Buddha's view is meant to be, the real application of it every day is preventative. We've got preventative medicine. Everything we do is preventative. You guys don't wait till the snow goes up to the ceiling before you start doing something about sweeping it away. You don't wait till your wheels fall off on the freeway before you go to the mechanic. You don't wait till we often do because we're so uncontrolled, until we're 400 kilos before we go on a diet. But we often do. We can see that because our attachment is so intense. We often don't wait. We do often get collapse on the street with our alcoholism before we start to change. So we can see we do have that. But in general, we have methodology for health, physical health. Not for mental health. We don't even know how to look at our mind until it's too late. Then it's too hard to deal with. It's so no wonder we all have mental breakdowns. Be with me, people. You understand? So this view of Buddhism is just start early, start young, start when things are going well. Then you can deal with your life every day. And I'm not joking here. This we can accomplish before we have realization, before we have concentration. Before we do it day and night. We can accomplish some real stability in our mind where we can handle what goes on in life instead of being pulled from pillar to post. That's the point the Buddha's making. And that's what gives us confidence. Are we clear? Communicating? What's your question, Esther?
It's a question about will. Like you mentioned self-respect, and if you're not trained in self-respect,
that's right. We're not
to really know what.
That's right.
And also what is will in one way? Like, is there actually
a
free will?
Yeah, of course.
So I have a question about close to what I experienced as aggression. I was at the retreat that is had this summer, and I had this to wake people up with a bell. But then I have some problem with being. This is really silly.
The microphone still has a problem.
What?
The noise constantly.
So when I was going to wake people up, I felt like, oh no, now I'm going to disturb them.
Oh, I see.
But that's so silly because I actually.
It was your job, and they wanted you to do it. Yeah,
they
that's right.
I
understand. Well, this is a good. Okay, Esther, that's a really good point you're touching on there. Okay, thank you. Well, you said several things. You said what is will, and you said self-respect, and then you said, and then the third point I'm going to answer. The third point's very interesting. Buddha's saying, we don't really learn this until we get to the bodhisattva path. The deepest attachment we have, more than the sex, drugs, rock and roll, money, power, all those things. That's gross level. But once we start to work on our mind and get more and more deep inside and recognize this neediness and recognize the attachment and recognize the aversion and work on it and process and become more stable, then we get to a deeper level when we start to realize the deepest attachment is to be seen as a nice girl and a nice boy. You're just upset. If you never got angry, you're a nice boy, Esther. You've been a nice boy. You've been a good boy. That means you never shouted and yelled at your mother. You did things to be nice boy. You did what you expected of you. You don't want to upset the apple cart. You don't like fighting. You don't like violence. So your attachment, my attachment was to get what I wanted, and I didn't care how many people I upset. Your attachment is to be a nice boy, to not upset anybody because you might get hurt. And that's exactly an example. Even if it was your job, they agreed you'd ring the bell, but you're nervous of upsetting them. What you're really nervous about is they won't like you. They might criticize you. That's the attachment we've all got, the deepest, deepest, deepest. And this is a shock to hear. This is the one in our head every single second. This dualistic, demented, schizophrenic voice of always talking to somebody else, always referencing someone else in our head, always thinking of what person thinks of us, always thinking of doing something and someone seeing me do it. It's there all the time. And it's a revelation when we can start to see this, and it's embarrassing. But that's our deepest attachment. So in other words, we're frantic. You could even say this attachment is the symptom of a really schizophrenic, unhappy, demented, low self-esteem, nothing person. In other words, we're nothing until someone... It's like that song that, I think, what's her name, that lady with a high voice who's now about 80. And it's very still gorgeous looking. Barbara Streisand. She looks impeccable, doesn't she? Anyway, what's that song? You're nobody if no one loves you. Isn't there a song like that? That's what attachment says. I am... The default assumption of attachment is I'm nothing until someone says I'm somebody. Can you hear that? That's the deep, and that's the suffering. Some of us have that in a really serious way, and that's what dissatisfaction. I am nothing because no one looks at me. Even when a stranger doesn't look at us perfectly, we have a panic attack because we're constantly craving this feedback from other people to give us confidence that even what I said was valid. We have attachment is having zero confidence in anything that you do, and you're always wanting other people to approve of us. That's our deepest attachment. Hello. Happy to see you. So happy to see you. So they say the yogis in the mountains who've given up everything, given up sex, drugs, rock and roll, money, you name it. They're still thinking about what the people in the village are thinking about them. I love that story. Do you understand? Because we've got this voice, because we see what we're doing, we're washing the dishes, and we're hoping the person we live with is noticing we're washing the dishes. Do you understand? So it works in the grossest and the most subtle ways. That's exactly that one. And we've all got it. And we call it, I don't want to upset people. Good boys like you say, I don't want to upset people. Rubbish. You don't want them to dislike you. But it's too embarrassing to admit that. You understand? I mean, there can be real compassion there as well. But it's not as if you have no compassion. It's not as if we don't also want to be mummy's little helper because we really do love mummy. But our attachment drives it. So it's more easy to see attachment in a person like me not getting what I want. You understand? Much harder if you're one of the quiet people or one of the depressed people or you understand? There is kindness in both of us. But it's harder to see how you're driven by the need to be seen as a nice boy and a nice girl. And that's where people in their relationships, that's the classic example of a person who is so kind, puts up with the horrible husband or the horrible wife, but then becomes a victim. And then always, why do people always abuse me? Why am I a doormat? It's because of attachment, not because of being kind. And it's very hard to distinguish the difference. And this only comes from inner work, from emotional awareness. It only comes from introspection, from practicing looking inside, not just looking outside. That's the job. We have to reverse the energy of the bomb and develop this ability to be inner aware. And it's not cosmic, but here we're using the Buddhist view of how you identify what you're seeing. And when you go beyond the emotions, as you get better and better at practice, you go beyond the emotional feeling of the physical, you get to hear this elaborate conceptual story that attachment is, that anger is, that anxiety is, that jealousy is. They're all elaborate conceptual stories, elaborate assumptions way deep down. And we have to listen to them. And then the point is, we have to start to see from the Buddhist perspective how they're misconceptions, how they're distorted conceptions. They don't have a valid basis. They're not accurate conceptions. That's Buddha's key point, which is very fascinating. Are you with me, people? What else? Any more questions? We're going to keep talking. Yeah, go, sure. 11:30. It's time for tea in a way. After you, we'll have a tea break. Go on.
I feel really attached to the Dharma books and to the practice of sitting meditation.
I understand.
Yeah. But I really don't know if it's a sane attachment.
I understand.
Or is it an
virtue?
Insane.
In other words, no. Is it a virtue or a non-virtue? That's your question.
Is it a virtue?
Good. Let's analyse. Go on. What?
No, I have
okay,
finished
let's
with my
analyse.
question.
Good. Let's analyse. Keep the microphone, because I want to ask you questions. Keep the microphone. Let's analyse it. The sign that it's attachment mostly is if when you can't do it or someone interrupts you, you get upset.
No.
Okay, then so it's virtue. So be happy. It's very simple. That's the answer. It's virtue. Are you hearing me? I just answered your question.
I hear you.
So it's not attachment. It's called listen. It's not attachment. Attachment is by definition a neurosis, a delusion, a neurotic, I-based, panic-stricken wish to get what I want. So if you're attached to your practice and your wife or your boyfriend or your dog come in and disturb you, I'm practicing, go away. That proves it's attachment. So then it's virtue, which means it's not called attachment. It's called the habit of wanting to practice Dharma. Rejoice. How amazing. But nevertheless, until you're highly realised, there will be some attachment there, and the Bodhisattva path says, great, go for it. Use your attachment wisely until you've eventually got rid of it. That's skillful means. So fantastic. Well done. Tick the box. Yes, all round. Do you understand?
Merci, madame.
Are you sure? Okay, good. Okay. So what else, people? We'll have tea time now. Tea break, okay? Tea and cake break or whatever it is. So see you, I don't know, we've got time all day, we've got until 5 o'clock. So it's now 11:30. We can have lunch any time?
1:30, I believe.
Oh, did we say that? Good, we'll have a half an hour break, half an hour cake and tea, and if you can, make it part of the day. Discuss this stuff while you're having your tea. I mean, you can discuss the politicians and the football if you like, but it makes it really helpful if you want to. Otherwise, be quiet, doesn't matter. Then it makes it all part of the day. Yes? Okay, I'll go into my room now and do something. Thank you. Okay, get my cup. I'll bring my cup with me. Thanks, darling. Yes, please, I will accept your help. I think I... Right. So far what we've been talking about, just to have as our framework the end result. Sangye, Buddha, rid of all the rubbish, full of all the goodness. So within, that's the long term. So therefore the job, obviously, if we're going to take it seriously, it's obvious, the job is implied. We have to learn to distinguish the rubbish from the goodness. Which again, like I'm saying, speaking of simple words, we don't have that view in our culture, like there are bad states of mind and good states of mind. You know, but this is Buddha's very clear thing. And the key point, which we've discussed, so therefore we have to start looking into the mental consciousness. Buddha divides the contents of our mental consciousness, the hundreds of thousands of thoughts in there, into three categories. There are those that are the neurotic, deluded, distorted misconceptions, the emotional, the difficult, the painful emotions. Then there are the valid ones, the reasonable ones, and then all the mechanics, I call it that. So the key point then, if the job is to distinguish between the rubbish stuff and the good stuff, we've got to see how you distinguish. What are the factors you're looking for? And this is where it gets distinctly into the Buddhist approach. We might agree that jealousy is painful and love is not. But unless you are precise about what jealousy is and what are the characteristics that it has that cause the pain, and therefore, if you think it's possible, how do you change? You have to know that, it's clear. And then you have to know what are the advantages of love, what is love. So the Buddha's approach, initially it seems very strange, but all these states of mind, these, as we call them, emotions, when we say emotions, what I'm saying, isn't it? We're referring to the obvious, more evident level when the body's involved. It's the best way to put it, when the body's involved. If you're depressed, your body can hardly move, you're inert. If you're angry, your body is violent. When and when you talk about jealousy or depression, you talk about like it's a physical feeling, isn't it? You know. So the way to put it here is that Buddha's saying all this stuff is roaring along deep inside us. We come programmed with all these viewpoints. They are viewpoints. Finally, they're viewpoints programmed since before. From the second of conception, we come into this life programmed with these tendencies, with these habits, you know. So the stronger, the more habitual they are, the more likely there is to be the emotions. But if they're not so strong, like some person, when something goes wrong, they might just go, oh, what a drag. That's it. That's the end of their anger. I mean, wow, I praise that person. That means they don't have very strong aversion, which means they haven't got very strong attachment, which means their mind is flexible. Oh, I can handle carrot cake, no problem. Do you understand? In other words, instead of, I ordered chocolate cake, how dare you give me carrot cake, I'm not going to come to this restaurant anymore. I mean, we know the difference. So the key thing here is it's the concepts. So if you think that everything in your mental consciousness, you know, is a bunch of thoughts, which initially seems ridiculous, because when we think thoughts, we think rational. You know, a thought is a rational thing. No! The neurotic ones aren't rational, they're irrational. But the point is, we are so overwhelmed by the feeling component. We get obsessed with the feeling component. So we've got to learn to look deeper, which is why, as I'm saying, even the beginnings of some kind of mindfulness meditation, concentration meditation, what you're learning to do, don't think of it as a magic tool that makes all the stuff go away. No, it's the simple technique that we'll do a bit, you know, that enables you to really, what you're trying to do is step out of your head. I mean, usually we're like this, immersed, aren't we? Immersed, but unconscious of what's happening. There's no awareness. You know, when you're trying to go to sleep at night, you can lie there for 3 or 4 hours tossing and turning, but you don't have a single memory of a single thought. You don't even know what you're thinking because you're so immersed in it, right? All these neurotic uncontrolled thoughts, isn't it? Well, that's happening all the time, surprisingly. But when you're busy cooking the dinner and driving the car and dealing with all the people on the outside world, you're not paying attention to all those thoughts. So when you're lying in bed with nothing else to look at, then of course you hear them going berserk, but they're always there. This is a surprise to us. They're always there, those crazy thoughts. But now there's nothing else to look at, so we're stuck in it. So we have to learn the skill to look inwards, and don't hear it as cosmic, it's practical. That means we've got to start getting some focus. And a simple, so that's what okay, let's talk about meditation then. Classic Buddhist meditation. There are 42 variations of it around the world, and that's okay. Buddha does not own meditation. He didn't make it up. He doesn't own it. He's not a creator. Anyone can use the word. But if you say you're doing Buddhist meditation, well, please be accurate. Well, if it is Buddhist, then say, but if it's not, if it's your own variation, then be honest. Otherwise, it's wrong marketing, isn't it? You're misleading people. So there are two kinds of meditation in Buddhism. Millions of techniques, but two modes of meditating. Two ways of using your mind. Well, the first one, the classic terms that are used, it's known as shamatha in Sanskrit. English usually translated as calm abiding. So it's a level of what's called single-pointed concentration. And the term in Sanskrit for that is samadhi. So there's levels and levels of that. And these great Hindus are the ones who created that, who accomplished that. And there are levels and levels and levels of subtlety of mind. And that the Buddha, he went as far as he could go in all that, and totally subduing all the grosser delusions. He got as far as he could go, but then and got to where they said what was liberation. But he said, no, there's more to remove from the mind still. There's still some leftover neuroses there. And that's in relation to his particular findings about the very nature of self. So then he diverged in his own direction, particularly in relation to his experiential findings about the nature of self. So now we have what's called Buddhism. Indeed, there are many interpretations over the centuries of just that, when you study stuff seriously, So, concentration meditation, we can call it that broadly. The world often would refer to it as mindfulness, but many people have made up their own variations and call it mindfulness. And that's okay, you're allowed to, but I'm going to tell you the Buddhist view of mindfulness meditation. They don't even call it that. We call it that. It's called concentration meditation. So then the second mode of meditation in general is known, and each of them is known in terms of the end result. They're known in terms of the accomplishment. So the second one is known as special insight. Now in English that's a great word. I don't know what your Swedish word is, but I know in Italian and French there's weird words. That makes it sound like religion. But insight, inner seeing, it's very good. We say in ordinary daily life, yeah, I thought about that problem and I got some insight into it. It's a great word. It's a perfect word. Inner seeing, not just with your eyes. It's a perfect word. Very nice. No, the French word's a very good one for it, but some other languages are ridiculous. Oh, okay. So insight is a great word. So clearly the obvious question is insight into what, please? Well, for the Buddha, it's really obvious, and all his different kinds of, and this is vipassana. So there's one that's in the world that's popularly known as vipassana, but it's one of the many insight meditations that Buddha taught, but it's often known as exclusively only as vipassana, that one. But it's just one of the many techniques. So basically you have to ask the question then, what does Buddha want us to get insight into? Well, it's really clear. Into how things exist, which tells us his whole approach to the mind, that the delusions in our mind, the neuroses, the misconceptions, are inaccurate in that they cause us not to see things accurately. This is a literal statement for the Buddha. This is the key function of all the neuroses. They have one function of being deeply disturbing, emotional disturbance. That's evident. Look at the angry person. Look at the anxious person. Look at the depressed person. Deeply disturbed. That's evident. But the key factor is that they're distorted conceptions, which are the habit, and then that we grow the emotional component on top of those misconceptions. And then we believe in those misconceptions. So when I'm angry with Martin, this is the point here, and my anger, let's say, is very strong because my attachment to get what I want from Martin is very strong, and I don't question any of those assumptions, this is how we all are, then the more he doesn't do what my attachment wants, the more angry I am with him. So we all know when that happens, you never question your assumptions, do you? I don't sit back and go, well, is my assumption that Martin should put the toilet seat down exactly as I like every day, is that a valid expectation? I don't ask that. I just assume because I'm attached to the toilet seat being a certain way, that he must do it. You get my point, don't you? I mean, this is all of us. This is attachment. See, this is the difference here. When he said, is it attachment or is it virtue that I like my practice? The sign that it's attachment to having the toilet seat down is if I get upset when it's not. But if I just like the toilet seat down because they say it's good feng shui, and they say that because it blocks all the money coming. You know, all the money goes down the toilet, so you have your toilet seat down and your door, your toilet seat and your toilet door closed. So let's say I'm into feng shui and I want the toilet seat down, and we both agreed, but he keeps forgetting that it's fine to want the toilet seat down, but if I get upset every time, that proves his attachment to the toilet seat being down. That's the difference. Can you get my point? In other words, there's nothing wrong with wanting the toilet seat down. There's nothing wrong with wanting to get to work quickly. But when the red light comes or the toilet seat is up and you get angry, that's the proof that you've got attachment to those things, and that's the difference. You get my point? And we have to distinguish that. So don't think that giving up attachment means giving up wanting anything. That's nihilism. That's absurd. So that anger is the response when he doesn't do what my attachment wants. So the thought is, when we can't distinguish the difference, this is our problem, because we don't have that level of nuanced look at our mind, an ability to look in such a nuanced way. We don't distinguish between wanting the toilet seat down and attached to the toilet seat down. We don't distinguish between wanting chocolate cake and attached to chocolate cake. We don't see the difference between wanting this and attached to it. That's the skill we have to cultivate. And that means we have to understand the characteristic of attachment that's different from merely wanting. Attachment is clinging to it, holding on to it. It's exaggerating its importance. And then a panic attack when it doesn't get what it wants. So to question our assumptions is one of the major ways we're trying to practice. So in other words, it's fine to want the toilet seat down, but to be attached to it, Buddha says it's not useful. It's not useful to you. It doesn't help him. It makes a mess because it's a distorted state of mind. It over-exaggerates the importance of the toilet seat being down, and it's just a voice of the ego. I want the toilet seat down. So it's, in its nature, it's a distorted, exaggerated expectation. It's a distorted conception. It's a series of, it's a bunch of thoughts. But this is so primordially deep in us, and it's pervasive, and we've all got it. This is what the definition of being in samsara is. I'm going to have to move here, so just wait. I'm not going to fall over. Okay? A little tweak. Thank you. So, see, in every other place, people warn me. They're paranoid about me falling off the back. And I say, no, I'm not going to fall, but nobody warned me this time, so I will get back, you know. It's very funny. I could sue the man. How much could I get from you? I sued the guy who ran over my foot when I first met Lama Yeshe. I got $4,000. That was 1976, so I probably got 40,000 from you. Oh, that's handy. Good amount. Okay. Oh, my knee is so sore. Oh, my shoulder's broken. Okay. Attachment. So the thing is, we don't, it's just to recognize that the neurotic states of mind that have emotional pain have this characteristic of being over-exaggerated assessments of something. That's their key function. So attachment over-exaggerates his deliciousness, over-exaggerates the importance of whatever it is I want. Some people are attached to things, some people are attached to getting what they want, some people are attached to people, some people are attached to food. We've all got different objects, you know. Don't understand? All got different objects. So attachment in general is the disease, and it's an over-exaggeration. That's what makes it a problem. It's not a valid state of mind. That's what it means. Doesn't mean it's not valid, meaning you're a naughty person, you're a sinner. No, because all states of mind have an object. They all are cognizing something. So attachment, is an over-exaggerated assessment of the deliciousness of the object, the money, the body, the food, the thing, whatever it might be. That's its problem. And then, of course, the pain of attachment is also one of the aspects of attachment is a belief that when I get the object, I'll get happy. But this is where the classic type of attachment, the obvious one of, like, say, the objects of the senses, food, alcohol, sex, the things that, that bring pleasure to the body, bring pleasure to our mind. The real, and this is now getting us, okay, this is interesting. This is now getting us to the second level of suffering in the First Noble Truth. The first level of suffering is when the bad things happen. But the second level of suffering is, the Buddha calls it merely the suffering of change. But he's referring to what we call happiness. So if the first kind of suffering is when attachment doesn't get what it wants, which is when the bad things happen, the second kind of suffering, a more nuanced, subtle level, is when attachment does get what it wants. So initially that's quite depressing. You mean I'm not even allowed to have pleasure? No, he's not saying that. This is the suffering of attachment. The first one's the suffering of anger. This is the suffering of attachment. So the belief of attachment, like the boyfriend, the obvious one, like the boyfriend, the cake, the whatever, is an utter deep assumption again, which we never question, that Martin will bring me happiness, which means he must do what my attachment wants. So there's this massive expectation that he is the cause of my happiness. This is really logical. We all think that. He's the cause of my happiness. That means the next level of attachment is I expect him, therefore, to do what I want, which is to make me happy. So the millisecond I don't feel happy, which is when he doesn't do what I want, then of course I blame him. So the point is, these are deep assumptions, but we never question. So the real practice in Buddhism is unpacking and noticing, observing, identifying these assumptions beyond the emotion. This is the real skill. And questioning those assumptions. You need courage to do that. Because I believe he'd better do what I want. It's his job. So to question that is very scary. And that's the point. If I'm analysing attachment, I have to look and say, is it valid for me to get angry every time he doesn't do what I want? And I have to analyse and say no. And the real point about this too is this. It was so interesting. Stop seeing it in a punitive way. Stop seeing this as kind of morality or even moralistic. Stop seeing it as someone saying you're a bad person. Buddha's being practical. He's basically saying that attached to getting what you want and then angry when you don't, forget the harm you do to other people. Who do you think you're harming? You're the suffering. You're the person who suffers from this. So it's a practical approach to stop you suffering. But it's very hard for us to hear that because we hear it in a moralistic way. Like, I'm not allowed to be angry. I'm a bad person. That's all nonsense. That's not the issue. And this is why it's hard, And because it's so habitual, we don't question our right to be attached to Martin doing what I want. We just assume it's true, So it's really this, we've got to look deep in and look at this. Otherwise, looking at our assumptions. An assumption is a series of concepts, very deeply ingrained, that we believed in as true. This is the work we have to do. This is the being your own therapist, as Amiyeshi puts it. Not kidding. So the second kind of suffering is when the good things happen. And this is really hard to recognize as suffering. You've got to be quite advanced in this practice, but at least we know it first theoretically. So why is getting what attachment wants a subtler, a deeper level of suffering than when attachment doesn't get what it wants, which seems a more evident kind of suffering because it's painful. So this is now where we have to, interesting, now look at the third category of states of mind again. Let's look into these, they call them negative, positive, and neutral. Neutral, not because they're not important, but neutral insofar as they're not virtuous and they're not non-virtuous. But they're necessary. Concentration is necessary. Mindfulness, which is, I was talking about meditation. I'm going to go back to it. I will come back to it. I'm going to come back to it. I'm talking insight now, but I'm going to put this in the framework of the two types of meditation. In a second, I'll come back to that. So, what did I say? What was I saying? Oh yeah, okay. Because attachment, like anger, is a liar. It exaggerates, and because it's a bit simple. It's very simple. If you've got a $50 krona note, but you believe it's 500, just say. Then you get very excited, don't you? And you have all this anticipation. And naturally, when you go to spend it, you expect 500 kronas worth. It's logical, isn't it? So what would be the response when the person who's in the shopkeeper, because they're not stupid, they recognize 50, then they will give you 50's worth. Well, naturally, you're going to be disappointed. Well, that's exactly a polite word for anger. When attachment doesn't get what it wants. So our attachment believes that Martin is the person to make me happy. And then my attachment exaggerates his deliciousness, which increases my expectation because he's so divine. And then I expect that his job is to do what my attachment wants every millisecond. So that's an expectation. So that's like expecting more from Martin than is valid. It's not his job, and he couldn't do that. And in other words, there's no way. Every time you spend 50's worth thinking it's 500, you will always be disappointed. So every time I expect Martin to make me happy, literally Buddha says you won't get happiness because it's not possible. This is the point. It's not moralistic, but it's just not possible. Because happiness is a state of mind in my mind. Happiness is a state of mind in my mind. So let's look at what that word means, happiness. So in the three categories of states of mind, attachment, for example, is an example of a negative, neurotic, distorted, deluded one. Love is an example of a valid, positive, useful, beneficial one that is valid because it's not distorted, it's not exaggerated. And third, look at, say, a state of mind which is very linked to these two called feeling. There's one of these many neutral states of mind called feeling, but not in the way we talk about emotion, not like that at all. It's like, and the Buddha says, given the way we're constructed, given we have a mind and a body, there's three kinds of feeling. There are feelings that are called pleasant, and they can be in the mind and through the sensory consciousness in the body. We have pleasant feelings, and that's another word for happiness. Clearly there are levels of it, from the mildest feeling of the warm air on a cold day to the most intense joy, triggered when you have your divine boyfriend. There's clearly a spectrum, isn't there, of pleasant feelings. The feeling itself is simply pleasant, and we label that happiness. The second kind of feelings are now called unpleasant, and another word for that is called suffering. And again, that's from the mildest cool, hot breeze on a hot day to the most intense, unbelievable pain of the worst kind of physical suffering. There's pleasant feelings, happiness. Unpleasant feelings, suffering. There's a third kind called neutral. Well, for our purposes here, forget all about them. Who cares? So now we know we want, just speaking normal world, we want happy feelings and we don't want unhappy feelings. Now this is where the point about happiness and suffering. When we describe now happiness, because we're so addicted to believing that the external world is the cause of those feelings, when we describe our happiness, we will describe the external world. Oh, tell me about your happiness, Robina. Tell me about your happiness, Robina. Well, the day was beautiful, the weather was good, Martin was kind, the food was delicious. Because we're so addicted to believing that the cause of those pleasant feelings is the external event, we almost conflate that with being happiness. Can you hear my point? You talk about happiness, you think of the object. You talk about unhappiness, I think of ugly Martin. He's looming large in my mind, why I'm so unhappy. But that's just the external event. That's just the mere trigger. It's a mere trigger for what's called an internal experience called a feeling. You get my point here? So it's very precise in Buddhist psychology. Pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling. So now, being in samsara, attachment's job, this junkie in us, it's a junkie in us, to find whatever object out there that I've got the karma to have a connection with, bodies, money, food, you name it. Attachment's job is to search for that object, and there's a very precise words here, such that when we have contact with that object, a pleasant feeling is triggered. That's how we spend our life. Now Buddha's saying, nothing wrong with good feelings. More the better, please. That's not a non-virtue, and it's not a virtue. It's a bare bones thing. It's not non-virtuous, and it's not virtuous. It's in the third category. It's like the mechanics of the mind. It's simply what happens. It has no character of being virtuous and no character of being non-virtuous. This is why these three types of categories are so important to understand in Buddhist psychology. So right now, without ever thinking and without any analysis, we completely mix attachment and pleasant feelings. And we mix anger and unpleasant feelings. But pleasant feeling, and therefore when we think, as Lama Zopa said, when we hear that Buddha says you've got to give up attachment, we go, oh, I've got to give up all my happiness. I've got to give up pleasant feelings, because we don't really know that they're different. Because we know that when attachment gets what it wants, it does in fact trigger a pleasant feeling. So we make the mistake of assuming the main cause of pleasant feelings is the chocolate cake, is Martin, is getting what I want. It's a misconception, it's a wrong analysis. Are you with me, people? Nothing wrong with pleasant feelings. In fact, this is really the point. Buddha's saying, you know what, guys? I have found a method that will bring you such unbelievable bliss, joy, ecstasy, rapture, happiness, pleasant feelings all the time without relying on an external object. It's free. That's what he means by nirvana. It's liberation from suffering because you've given up attachment. So our view is this: happiness, pleasant feelings, are what we get when we get what attachment wants. And that's our methodology. But Buddha says, no, no, baby. Happiness, pleasant feelings, is what we get when we give up attachment. Sorry, shouting. And that's why it's so hard. That's why we've got to understand these words precisely. We don't have these definitions in our culture, in our science, in our modern psychology. This is Buddhist psychology. And this is the point about the mind, when we're reading from Lama Yeshe in his Mahamudra, which I'll read later. It's very inspiring. So Buddha's view of the mind is so outrageous, it's so amazing, so marvellous, so inspiring, that our mind, which is not physical, has the natural potential to be joyful, happy. Natural. It's completely natural. And what prevents our experiencing of that natural potential for joy, whatever word you like, is the presence of the delusions, the presence of the pollution in our mind. You know, the disturbing emotions of attachment and anger and fears and jealousy and neurosis, all of them pervading our mind all the time, covering our true nature. And don't hear this as religion, please. Covering our natural potential for clarity and joy and bliss, not to mention love and compassion. This is literally what Buddha is saying. So getting Singapore in concentration, you know, in the text it describes it in terms of 9 stages of cultivation, coming from the Hindus, invented thousands of years ago. And people today, right now, countless people have been, since then, millions have been achieving and are achieving this second. Up in the mountains somewhere, they're getting it. People like you and me, Swedish people, Australian people, not just Asians, getting single point of concentration. Buddha says we've had it countless lifetimes, but we've lost it, you know. So Lama Yeshe, he waxes, where's my iPad? Oh, I left it in my room. Can I have it, somebody? Thanks, Kaiser, darling, my iPad, yeah. I'll read you. In this wonderful book of Lama Yeshe's, Mahamudra, How to Discover Our True Nature, it's exactly a presentation of these 2 modes of meditation: concentration meditation and insight meditation. And it's a particular method for realizing ultimate reality, finally realizing the reality of emptiness, which we'll talk about. So Lama, being so kind and so sort of inspiring, he tells us some of the qualities that we'd accomplish having single point of concentration. Normally in the text that is tell you all the technicalities of each stage, but Lama wants to make us excited. So he gets us excited by showing us our own potential. This is not the reason you concentrate. This is not the reason you meditate. But it's one of the byproducts. It's like a bonus. Because the reason we concentrate is to get insight, and we're going to go into that in more detail. Are we communicating here? Good, happy. Mahamudra, okay. How to Discover Our True Nature. Came out in September. Wisdom published it. You can get it digital as well. Mahamudra. Oh, where'd you get it? You bought it somewhere else? Yeah. You've got to get it in the shop. Yeah. Definitely. Good. Wonderful. Show people. Put it up. Lift it up high. See? Just have a look. There it is. Mahamudra. Very short little book. So cute. So sweet. So wonderful. Chapter 5, the benefits of Samadhi, concentration, are incredible. Okay. As I mentioned, to achieve the realization of Mahamudra, and this is another word for emptiness, to realize ultimate reality, finally to cut the root of all the rubbish so you can discover your true nature, so your mind can be in the nature of bliss, so you can have love, compassion, and be of benefit to others. It's just, this is Buddhism. It's practical. We need, so to achieve the realization of Mahamudra, the reality of non-duality, we first need to develop calm abiding. In fact, it's not possible without it. We're talking, of course, long term. So we must achieve the subtler levels of consciousness of an indestructible one-pointed concentration, what in Sanskrit we call samadhi. It is difficult to realize non-duality, not because it's hiding from us, but because our concepts are so thick, our misconceptions are thick, driving our mind, polluting our mind. This is our problem, So we must refine our concepts. We must achieve subtle mindfulness, subtle awareness, and subtle clarity. Otherwise, there's no way we can see the unconscious levels of ego grasping an independent self. Not possible. Samadhi is the source of liberation. Without perfect samadhi, then there is no way to become liberated from samsara and no way to achieve enlightenment. There is no exception. Whether we are Christian, Muslim, Hindu or Buddhist, to cut the dualistic view, we need calm abiding. On the other hand, some people actually think that this state of samadhi, this one-pointed concentration, is all we need in order to cut ego. Now the point about this is that this technique is astonishing. It does help you completely subdue all the neuroses, all the delusions. And you can go to the subtlest level, even beyond this. They're called the formless realms. The Hindus went as far as they can go in the deepest of absorption in this state, necessarily subduing all the delusions, achieving this. And they said, that's as far as you can go. That's liberation. And that's where Buddha said, no, there's more to go. They're still positing a subtle sense of a concrete, real self. That's why single point of concentration is not enough. It's stupendous, unbelievable, but not enough. We also need, so Lama Tsongkhapa reminds us that calm abiding alone is not enough to cut the dualistic view. We also need to develop special insight, or vipassana in Sanskrit. In Tibetan we call it hlak tong. Hlak meaning extra and tong meaning seeing. We can interpret this to mean that we go beyond seeing conventional reality and achieve the extra seeing of the universal reality of Mahamudra. In other words, we need the two kinds of meditation together, calm abiding and special insight. And I'll discuss that more later. So, the benefits of samadhi are incredible. Nevertheless, even without special insight, the results of samadhi alone are unbelievable, almost unimaginable, certainly from the perspective of Western psychology and Western science. No question. When we understand this, when we realize how amazing the results are, we cannot help but try to develop it. There's no way we become lazy. We'll have much energy and make great effort. We won't even worry about eating. I'll explain some of the benefits. As your concentration develops, it's described in great detail in all the literature in terms of 9 stages of cultivation, various things, each step of the way that you accomplish, don't accomplish. It's all very technical, but this is like experiential. Give us excitement, get us excited. Lama did that. As your concentration develops, you will go beyond your body. Your mind will be non-conceptual. So it becomes easy to cut the complex world of the 5 sense objects, to eliminate all the superstitions. In such a unified state, your mind becomes so subtle, so sharp, you can easily eradicate the complex dualistic thoughts. You can touch reality. This is the feature of samadhi. And out of meditation, you can easily deal with your delusions. They are so light, you can stop them immediately. In other words, it's a practical issue. If we've got no concentration, which we don't have now because we don't have techniques in our world, and as we know, our mind is just berserk all day, it's just underneath. It's a miracle we're not all going completely crazy, but all the thoughts underneath we never deal with. Then when you've got concentration, this is almost inconceivable to us, the thoughts aren't crazy. It's like you've managed all the thoughts, you've edited them all, they're all organized, and they're completely subdued. And you can deal with any delusion that might pop up right there at a subtle level. Nowhere, a million times before it gets anywhere near the emotions. This is hard to conceive of. This is practical. This is technical. You experience bliss. It sounds like naughty, doesn't it? Even pleasure sounds a bit sort of religious. Oh, that sounds naughty. You can't have pleasure. In the subtle state of concentration, you experience bliss, ecstatic bliss. Just naturally. Lama somehow knew all these words. He couldn't speak English. He was a disaster. And these are his words, edited nicely, but they're his words. We're not made up words, I promise. He had this ability to somehow know the words to choose. It was amazing when he first met Westerners in the 60s. The more concentration you have, the more integrated you are, and thus the more rapture, the more bliss you experience. The point is to hear this point, please. Think now, our lives, being embodied, we've got these bodies, right, which are dominant, absolutely dominate our lives, frantically all day thinking only about the body to make sure we get pleasant feelings and don't have unpleasant feelings, have to feed them and sleep them and touch them and clothe them and wash them. You understand? I mean, it absolutely dominates our lives. In fact, as far as we're concerned, this is who I am. I'm the body. That's it. So just to get a pleasant feeling takes an immense amount of work, doesn't it? You wake up in the morning and you're hungry. So you're distressed. The mind is distressed because the body, is doing its things and the stomach rumbles. So you've got to do all this work to go to the kitchen, to get the stove, get the coffee pot, do this, have a stove in the first place, have a house in the first place, pay rent, get a job to do that, so you can buy coffee and a coffee machine and do the beans and crunch them and put them in and get the water in a tap, which you have to pay the company for, the world, you have to pay the tap. Then you have to get the water in there, the gas. You turn it on, you put it on, you have to mix it with the poor old cow milk, and you drink it. And the first mouthful is the best pleasure. It's downhill from there. And it lasts about a second. And this is getting us now to the second kind of suffering, the suffering of change. Because in other words, we don't know how to trigger a pleasant feeling without getting an object. This is the point. All that work just to have, and then the first mouthful, and then all the anticipation, all the misconceptions, all the exaggerating of the happiness that's going to come when you get your coffee, and then the first mouthful, and already you're greedily getting the second mouthful, greedily anticipating more happiness, but already if we really analyse, the happiness is going down from there. And by the time you get to the bottom of the cup, and you're still trying to get the happiness, but as you're going, already it's changing and this is the point now about why it's called the suffering of change. The first moment is pleasure. He doesn't argue with that. It does trigger a pleasant feeling in your mind. It does. But we are hungrily wanting more of that pleasure. So we have the second mouthful, still all perky and excited, convinced it will come. But if you really analyse, even the second mouthful, maybe that's pretty good, but the third, the fourth, and by the end of the cup, you're dying already anticipating the second cup, but it's never as delicious. We know that. And by the time you've eaten and drunk the third, the second cup, you're now what? You're now full. And you look at the different delicious cafe latte of someone else's and you go, oh, yuck. I'm full. So it's already become an ugly object. Already if you kept drinking cafe latte, you would vomit. The Buddha says this is the logical scientific proof that it changes from a pleasant feeling inexorably, gradually, with more contact with that object, into unpleasant feelings. This is scientific truth, but we can't bear it because we don't have an alternative method for getting happiness. It's not being mean. It's being technical, being scientific. So all Buddha's saying is not only do you not get real happiness from the coffee, you do get some, you do get something, it's guaranteed. But all it's doing is like the junkie, it's like your fix. It allays the pain of craving enough until the next coffee. That's about the best we can get with pleasure. But not only does it bring genuine pleasure, and we don't have a concept of genuine pleasure, it just sounds like silly, like religious. But it even, the worst, the saddest part of attachment is it actually brings more craving tomorrow. That's what the junkie is. And that's evident with the junkie, or the alcoholic, or the sex, the sex person, whatever you're attached to. The more you, as my mother would say, the more you get, the more you want. That's the Buddha's point. And we all know it, but we just don't join the dots. We don't think it through. We don't get the revelation of it. Because we don't have an alternative. So Buddha says, I've got a method for you, babes. Just get single point of concentration. And you're going to get such bliss you won't believe it. And anybody you talk to, people who talk, who quietly, humbly will tell you about their meditation experiences, and you hear it in the text, and you hear it from the yogis, this bliss that they're talking about, which sounds like, to us, hyperventilating and hysterical, when you talk about ecstatic bliss, rapture, you see a person hyperventilating, hysterical, hysterical. Our bliss is hysterical bliss. I mean, I'm not being gross here, but look at when you have sex, it's hysterical bliss. Lots of noise and movement and lots of energy. It's not peaceful bliss. But everybody says this is unbelievably peaceful bliss. We can't conceive of that. Are we communicating here? Okay. In the beginning, the bliss you experience is physical, which is a grosser level. But as your concentration deepens, as you throw off the layers of blankets of grosser consciousness in your meditation, as you get more subtle, which means you're going beyond the conceptual level and beyond the physical. Of course, we don't posit such a level of consciousness in our culture, and if we do, we don't know how to access it. It's like a kind of a hit and miss, As we throw off the layers of blankets of grosser consciousness, you experience bliss exclusively at the mental level. The sense is not involved. Remember Venerable Rene, the wonderful Swiss monk? Do you ever invite him? Do you invite him? Never. Where's Kaiser? You must invite Rene. He comes to Switzerland. You keep inviting, but he comes to Switzerland to see his mummy, So you must grab him when he does. Okay, but beforehand, well before, a year in advance. So the point is, he's a meditator, serious meditator for like 40 years. In and out of meditation retreats, comes out, teaches, studies more, goes back in, I interviewed him in Mandala magazine in 1995. And he'd talked about his 2.5-year retreat at Urselling in Spain, up in the mountains above Granada. And he was very humble, he talked about it, And that's 24 years ago. So he said then he maybe touched upon the 5th of the 9 stages of this concentration technique, he said. And he said something like this. He said, there's no question, I forget the words, that the joy he experienced in his mind was so superior to any joy he'd ever experienced through his senses. So this is really this is a practical, technical issue. When we hear about it, we just hear it as cosmic and religious and mystical and all this rubbish, And this technique was invented by these Indians thousands of years ago. And we know nothing about it in our culture. Even when we study mindfulness, we know nothing about this. It's unbelievable, these people, such geniuses, This is because it's only mental, because this is because you've stopped perceiving the objects of the 5 senses. You have closed the door to superstitions. All the contradictory concepts have disappeared. Your mind is now crystal clear. As your concentration gets stronger and you reach ever subtler levels, your mind becomes super powerful. From his own experience, Lama Tsongkhapa says that you can reach a point of such clarity in your meditation that your mind feels almost infinite. Your mind is so clear, so sharp, it's as if you can distinguish all the subtle physical energies. You'll have the courageous thought, I can count all the atoms of the universe. This level of mind is more powerful than even scientific instruments. And he means that literally, Now I think I'm showing pride in Buddhism. You are always joyful. When you arise from your meditation, you feel liberated instead of uncertain and full of doubts and conflicts. You experience inner peace. And this is the point. When we hear peace, it's boring, isn't it? We don't think bliss, do we? But these two come together. Very fascinating, isn't it? Utter joy, utter contentment, fulfillment, not hungry, not anxious, not neurotic, not angry, not wanting, craving more all the time, not jealous, not low self-esteem, not depressed. Try and conceive of that. This is our potential. This is not even realizing emptiness yet. And we've had this in countless lifetimes, Buddha says. We lost the plot. We kept losing the plot. This is our potential. Natural mental potential. But as Venerable Rene said, he said with certainty, back even then, that's 25 years ago, with certainty, he wouldn't have been qualified to even get to the mountains, to do this, to get to that level without years of practice and purification and hearing the teachings and even giving the teachings. That's what prepared him. In other words, to go off and compete with Lance Armstrong tomorrow, you've got to do years and years of practice first, don't you? So going to the mountains to get concentration is like that. You can't just go there and just do it. You're not qualified. You've got to do years of preparation and understanding first to get you to that. And that's what we can start now, slowly, slowly. And when you die, because nothing ever goes astray for the Buddha, nothing ever goes astray. There's nothing we've ever experienced in our mind since beginning this time that isn't stored in our mind. That's why we can have clairvoyance. That's logical for the Buddha. Nothing goes astray. So be happy that we're sowing our seeds, doing our cycling every weekend. You know, will we Lance Armstrong one life or other? Do a little bit every day. Sow the seeds, you know, be happy with that. You experience inner peace. You'll always have a joyful, happy vibration. In fact, you continuously experience tremendous pleasure. When you hear the word pleasure, it's kind of exciting. Peace sounds boring, but pleasure, wow, I like that. Now the pleasure of chocolate is nothing to you. Not to mention bodies and everything else. What you can now experience with your mind is super. It's like another realm, another dimension. And when your senses do come into contact with the objects, of course, you experience bliss then too. It's like a bonus extra bliss, you know. You hardly even notice that it's night or day. Actually, even now, when you have samsaric happiness, you have a similar kind of experience. You dance and drink all night, intoxicated with the pleasure. Time just flies. Oh, now it's morning already? Well, this is what happens when you're intoxicated with the blissful experience of samadhi. And he means it, literally. And of course, this shows that time is not fixed from the outside. It's made up by your mind, you know. Your body feels so light. They have a name for it. It's called pliancy, physical pliancy. There's some particular kind of quality of your body once you've really got good concentration, because you can, in using the subtler level of looking at our energy, the tantric one, there's certain wind energies that become infinitely, that manifest when you've got concentration. So your body, even though you could be, 400 kilos, your body would be like a feather. You'd be joyful and infinitely flexible. You know how our body feels like lead sometimes, especially when we're miserable. It becomes like light as a feather, as if you've got no body at all. Because your mind is so clear. You develop clairvoyance. Because everything you've ever experienced in your mind gets stored there as a memory. As Lama Zopa says, we're like shooting movies all day, and everything gets stored in our mind. But we can see we don't remember 99.99% of even today, and it's only 12:30. Because conceptuality doesn't have that capacity. But everything's stored there, like as images and memories. That's how when we clarify our mind and get rid of delusions, we can see the minds of others. We can see the past, see the future. This is natural at the subtle level. Lama Tsongkhapa says you'll develop clairvoyance. According to the Abhidharma teachings, there are two kinds. One is what we understand as intuition, an untrained sense that we all have to some extent. For example, you might feel strongly without any logical proof that something has happened to your dear friend back home. The other can be gained by training the mind in meditation, as we're discussing here. You are able to see long distances as well as other people, including their minds. At first your experience seems like a dream, but the more your concentration develops, the more clearly you can see, just as you would if you were there in person. This kind of clairvoyance is not imagining something. It's real, in the present, not a fantasy. Normally, with your deluded thoughts, you create images of your boyfriend in your mind when he's not there, let's say, and it's almost as if he's real. But when it's clairvoyance, you literally see your boyfriend. And the only way to comprehend this is by asserting, which is what Buddha's saying, that we do have these subtler levels of mind that are capable, therefore, of cognizing phenomena that are subtler than the gross ones we can cognize now with our conceptuality and our sensory. That's why it's logical, you know. And this technique's available to anybody. You're really clever at it, really qualified, you can get it in a couple of years, you know. But not at home while you're looking after your kids and your husband. Unless you're highly realised. Unless you come into this life with lots of qualities already. Then of course you can. Any questions about all that? It's just concentration meditation. We haven't discussed insight yet.
I have a question.
Oh,
Sorry.
yes.
It's very interesting. I really like to know, you mentioned the calm abiding and especially insight. I listen a lot also to His Holiness talking. He referred to that very often. I don't know much about this special insight. If you can
I'm going to talk about that. I will eventually.
Okay.
Yeah, I will. That's the point. Yeah,
Thank
exactly. I will. This is concentration. Any questions about it? Nothing. Okay. Okay. So, okay. This is where we get very confused, because we're so addicted to thinking that this is meditation and that's it. Well, people who do mindfulness, all the variations, they're all variations of concentration. And we think that's meditation. That's meditation. But for the Buddha, this is just preparing your mind. It's like accessing the microscope of your mind, so that you now use that clarity, that wisdom, to then get insight. So now let's look at what that means simply. Simply. In general. Insight in general. Right now, the Buddha is saying that because of all these delusions, we are living in la-la land in relation to reality. These delusions, as Lama Zopa says, what these delusions do, delusion is a great word for these unhappy emotions. It indicates that particular function of distorting reality. So again, remember, attachment, for example, when it's in the mind, and it's particularly focused on the object called chocolate cake. In the simplest way possible, we can see that what it does is cause the chocolate cake to look more delicious than it really is. The more hungry, the more emotion, the more attached, meaning this emotional hunger, not just physical hunger, emotional hunger I have for chocolate cake. We know, logically, we know the cake that I see on the plate is a divine, delicious, heavenly, wonderful, wow cake, such that when I get it, the amount of pleasure will be equal to that fantasy. Is this not how we understand this, don't we? When you're in love with somebody, this is an extreme example of attachment. Now get the distinction between attachment and the pleasure that it triggers. We conflate those two. But the attachment is the build-up, the anticipation, the thinking all day and all night about Martin. Never stop thinking about him, exaggerating. You're obsessed with him. You can't stop thinking about him. We understand this. This is a function of attachment. You're obsessed with the object. You think of it all the time. You anticipate having contact with it. You're craving to have contact. You can't bear to be separate from it. That's an extreme example of attachment to any of the objects of the senses. That's a sign of it. You think about it all the time. You can't bear to be separate from it. You want to have contact with it all the time. The more strong the attachment is. So that's all Buddha's saying, is that attachment is a grotesque and bizarre exaggeration of the deliciousness of Martin. It's a complete extreme, absurd exaggeration of Martin. But we don't question it. It's a deep assumption. It's based on, the only reason you have attachment for an outside object is, as like I said before, it's the extent to which you feel like you're nothing. Like you're empty, you're nothing. So this fantasy, this object, so you've got to have full contact with it, and then the belief is, when I get it, I'll get bliss. And indeed it does trigger bliss, initially contact with Martin. But I'm sorry, being gross here, keep having contact with Martin. I don't mean go to sleep and get hungry again. I mean keep having sexual contact with the object. You will die of exhaustion and revulsion. He will be the most disgusting person when he says, let's keep doing it. I mean, I'm being gross here, but get the point. If you keep eating chocolate cake, don't wait till you're hungry again and go to the toilet. Keep eating it. This is the proof that chocolate cake is not the cause of happiness. Because if it were, logically, contact with Martin, the more you have contact, the happier you will get. But we know the more you have contact, the happiness goes down and turns into aversion or boredom, one or the other. And you chuck him out and get another one. So delusions, Buddha's saying, all these delusions, the branch delusions, attachment, anxiety, depression, you name them, these emotional pains, have this conceptual characteristic, because they're so deep in our bones, at the level of assumption that we don't question, therefore don't analyse and don't unpack. So and we live according to them, and we believe totally the stories they tell us. Therefore, because they are liars, they're not an accurate assessment. So that's what Buddha's saying. So what he wants us to get insight into, in general, is into how things actually do exist, even conventionally. But forget the special insight. That's the insight into the subtlest understanding of reality. Just look at ordinary reality, of cakes and martins and things and weather and this and that. When they're seen through the lenses of aversion, anxiety, depression, attachment, we're not seeing what's real. We're seeing our own projection. We're seeing a story that we have made up, and we plonk that story onto the object. So we're not in touch with reality. So getting insight, Buddha wants us to get insight into how things exist. So he's got many levels of how things exist. He says at the very beginning of his teachings that things are impermanent. One of the lies in our mind, we believe instinctively that I'm a permanent person. Well, of course we know we're going to die, but we don't believe it because we can't stand the thought of it. We believe this relationship with Martin is permanent. We'll be together till we're 80, guaranteed. That's a complete projection, a complete craving and fantasy, because attachment can't bear the thought that Martin might leave me or might die. So we fantasize, we believe in this grasping at permanence, that we will be together forever. It's a lie. Things don't exist like that. That's grasping at things as permanent. That's another lie. Attachment that is divine is another lie. So they're all not how things exist. Buddha says we're living in la-la land. So he wants us in general, being a Buddhist in general, by lessening your delusions, you're increasing your capacity to be in sync with how things exist. So by thinking about impermanence, getting insight into impermanence by thinking about it is a classic example of meditating on doing an insight meditation. But when we hear the word meditation, we get confused. So insight in general is working out how things exist. This is what we do every day when we learn things, but we don't call it meditation. So if you go and learn mathematics and the teacher tells you that 1 + 1 is 2, brand new information for you, you've never heard it before. So you take it home, you go. So the teacher says to you, I want you to go home, Robina, I want you to get some concentration. Then when you're settled, I want you to go to the second mode of meditation, and I want you to get insight into this. That's what she'd say. Well, what is she saying? Go do your homework. What does she mean? Go home. You've got to close the door because the other kids will come in and out. You get no concentration. You've got to do anything. You've got to have concentration, isn't it? If you can't focus on what you're doing, you can't achieve anything. So you need some concentration. This is normal world. So you close the door, tell the kids to shut up. You get your little pencil, get your blocks, you get your piece of paper. You have to have the information the teacher gave you. 1 + 1 is 2. You have to know what it means intellectually, and then you work through it. You think it through, don't you? Don't you think it through? And then one moment you go, oh, I get it. That is an insight. You just achieved an insight. So you have concentration that helps you focus. You go to the second mode. You use logical analysis, thinking, and then that process triggers the insight. That's called doing your homework. That's called learning how to play the violin, how to do mathematics, how to make a cake. It's an ordinary behaviour. Insight is when you're making a cake, you're getting insight in how the cake works, which means you have to have all the right ingredients, you have to know how much of this, how much of that, and you've got to have concentration to do it properly. So we all understand insight and concentration. We just don't call it that. Are we communicating here? Well, here, you've got to get your concentration, and Buddha's a genius at that. You get your focus. Now you go to the second mode, and you want to get insight into what? Well, impermanence, please. So what are you going to do? You've got to have the words about impermanence that Buddha gives you. So you think it through, like your violin music, like your mathematics. You think it through in focus, with a focus in your meditation. And then you'll get an experience, an insight into impermanence. So you'll stop the analysis, and you'll just focus on that, and you'll get the taste of impermanence ever deeper, ever deeper. That's how you learn to play piano. That's how you learn to do anything. We just don't call it insight. We don't call it meditation. Are we communicating here? Are we communicating? Yes? Good. It's common sense, but we mystify because we have all these other words, we don't know what it means, you know. So you know if you're a Tibetan Buddhist, and the classic one of getting special insight is into emptiness, that's the final one. Then you'll hear about how we do analytical meditation, and that really throws us. Well, you know, first of all, let's look at the word meditation in Tibetan. It's a shock to us. It's the verb gom, and it means to become familiar with something. To familiarise your mind with something. Well, that's interesting. Who thought meditation meant that? We don't. We think it means this, spacing out. No, that's just concentration. That's just the first step. Real meditation is insight. And in other words, insight's the point. Concentration is just a method to get you to it. And it happens to have its bonus benefits, which Lama tells us about. So analytical meditation, well, meditation means to familiarise your mind. And analytical is a fancy word for to think about. I'm sorry. So you simply use thinking. How do you get to understand your mathematics? You think it through. How do you play the violin? You think through the music and then you play it with your hands. How do you make a cake? You think through the recipe. You do the instruction, you think it through until eventually you have an experience, an insight into the recipe and how it works. This is just common sense. It's how we have learned anything in our life. This is just what this is. You listen, you get some concentration first. And then you go to the second mode and you take the teachings you've heard about impermanence. You take the teachings you've heard about karma. You take the teachings on the nature of mind. You take the teachings on emptiness. This is all the stuff of Buddhism. And you want to get insight into it. So you've got to have focus. You go to the second mode. You take what you've learned in your class. You think it through with focused mind. And the deeper the focus, the deeper the insight, because the mind is clear. And you'll get a taste of it. And you stop your analysis and you taste that insight. Then the mind gets a bit shaky again. You go back to the analysis and you keep getting deeper and deeper and deeper until you get deep, irreversible insights. Incontrovertible, irreversible, until the insights are genuine. And finally, you've got to get insight into the ultimate reality that nothing has an intrinsic nature, and that's the realization of emptiness. When you've got that insight, the very first second of your non-conceptual direct insight into the reality of the absence of inherent existent I based upon single point of concentration, that's the first second that you climb out of samsara and proceed into your nirvana. You've got a way to go yet, but you can't fall back after that. Are we communicating here? Good. So to unpack these words and concepts is kind of important, you know. Don't just put them in religion and mystify them and say them like just without knowing what we're talking about. It's a practical process that we're all very familiar with. It's just that we don't call them that. That's all, you know. So the one that's in the world, Vipassana, is one of the many techniques that Lord Buddha taught. About the one I've never done it, but scanning the experiences of the body. Is that right? That's one of the many insights. And what does he want us to get insight into? Impermanence. That's his method. That's why he wanted us. That's what he wants us to get insight into. Impermanence in that case. There's many he taught. And concentration is just the method we use to enable us to get insight. But we often, again, when people do Vipassana, they're doing both types. They're doing concentration and insight. People who are doing mindfulness are doing both, but they think it's the same. They're not. We just got it wrong. We were not clear, you know. Do you understand? Are we clear, people? A little bit? I mean, I don't know much. I act like I know everything, don't I? Yes. Go, darling.
If I ask you, do you understand what I say now? If I tell you thinking beyond thinking?
You mean experiencing the taste of it? No?
Beyond that.
Well, there is only the experience of the taste beyond the thinking. There's this thinking, and then that's you use that to experience the taste of the meaning of it. That's insight.
Yes. Okay. I'm unable at that state to go deeply with words.
Yeah, I understand.
And even in French, it will be because insight. I experienced some movement to another part, and I call it thinking beyond thinking.
I understand. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what your experiences are. I can't describe because I don't know those words.
No.
But if you read Lama Yeshe's book on these exact things,
Yeah.
then you can relate your experiences to that, and maybe you can speak about them in those terms. Because the typical way of talking is at the very gross. We have gross consciousness, which is the chatty mind berserk, you know.
Yeah.
And then as we get more clarity, even intellectually, the mind can become more clear. You get clear thinking. But then as you go deeper in meditation, you eventually go beyond the concepts completely cease. There's no thinking. Then beyond thinking is non-conceptual, and it's not thinking though. It's just the mind is completely still.
Is the thinking by non-thinking?
No,
You say that?
no. You start with thinking,
Yes,
and then you concentrate, and then the mind gets eventually to the point when you've got really good concentration, the mind literally stops all concepts. That's literally. As your mind gets more subtle, it becomes non-conceptual.
Why do we have those differences to speak about the same thing? For example, in the Zen tradition,
Yes.
we are talking about almost the same thing that
Yes.
the Tibetan tradition do but we have other words.
I know, that's because even in Tibetan Buddhism, even in the different traditions in Tibet, they have all the different ways they
Because
talk.
in Dzogchen
Yeah.
and
Uh-huh.
Mahamudra,
Yes.
there is a difference.
There is, and there are many differences, and there even, as I'm saying, in the Tibetan Buddhism, even the 4 different traditions, they talk very, because it's human beings in a certain place of the world developing its own characteristics and its own way of talking. It's inevitable we're going to use different words. That's nothing wrong with that. That's nothing wrong. That's why we have to learn all the different meanings so we know we're on the same page, and that's difficult. Of course, there's many ways of talking, and that's why they have all their debates and their interesting discussions. It's very healthy. Nothing wrong with that.
So can we say also that the meeting beyond words and beyond intellect, I see you and you see me, and it's enough?
I don't know. That sounds a bit cosmic to me, Samir. Maybe. I can...
I'm really here.
No, I know, I understand. Listen, all I can do is use the words that I understand and try to experience. So the less delusions in my mind,
Yeah.
the less projections, the less expectation,
Yeah.
the less fantasy, the more clear everything will appear.
Yes.
That's it. That's the one. So gradually, yes.
Thank you.
That's a pleasure. What else, people? Nothing? Yes? Yes. A hand back there. No. No? No? What time is it? We can stop and have lunch now if you like. Easy. We can have lunch. There's no questions. So did you all bring it? Did you remind people to bring their lunch? I bet you forgot. You forgot, didn't you? You forgot.
I didn't forget.
You didn't forget. You
I
did last
didn't.
night or this morning?
I did this morning because I
Oh,
was waiting for that email.
Oh no, but you didn't remind me.
No, I didn't remind
That's
you.
exactly right. So don't you blame me.
I'm not blaming you.
So that's the wrong answer. So the answer was, I forgot to remind you, Robina. Wasn't it? That's the right answer?
Yes.
Thank you, Martin. If you can't locate the problem, you can't find the solution. That's very important. So anyway, if you did bring your lunch today, I'm very happy. Then share all your lunch and have little groups around and sit and discuss all this stuff. But if you don't want to discuss, that's completely fine. You don't have to. But I would love you to do that. And then I don't think we need 2 hours.
No, an hour
90
and a
minutes.
half was...
That's more than enough, yeah. Good,
Yeah,
okay.
So,
Yeah.
20 to 3?
Yeah, whatever. That's okay, people. So please enjoy. Yeah. Okay, darlings, thank you so much. See you soon. Thank you.